Moira, we're ready.
Okay, I'm recording.
I see it's being recorded, so I would love to have a copy when it's available.
Okay.
Did you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
you got it.
okay.
Today's date is April 27th, 2021. I have the pleasure of interviewing Sonia Pressman Fuentes for USC Shoah Foundation. This interview is remote. Sonia is located in Sarasota, Florida, and I am in Los Angeles, California. Would you please state your name?
Sonia Pressman Fuentes.
And was that your name at birth?
No, because part of it is my married name, and I was born single. What are you really asking me?
What was the name your parents gave you at birth?
Sonia Pressman.
Did you ever have any nicknames?
Sonny.
And where were you born?
I was born in Berlin, Germany,
And when were you born?
1928.
What is your father's name?
My father's name was Zisha Pressman.
And where was he born?
He was born in a shtetl or village in Poland whose official name was Pilitsa, but the Jews called it Pilz.
And do you know when he was born?
He was born in 1893.
And what is your mother's name?
My mother's name was Hindalaya Pressman. Well, her maiden name was Dumbik.
And where was she born?
In the same village.
And do you know when?
1892.
Do you know the names of your father's parents?
I know absolutely nothing about his father. His mother's name was Udal Ulmer.
And do you know anything about her?
Yes, I know a little bit about her, and I had met her once, and I knew of her. I know that she had 3 husbands, and that she ran a bakery in Pilz.
What were the names of your mother's parents?
My mother's name was Shandla, Chandla, and I'm named after her. My Yiddish name is Scheindel. My mother's father's name was Moshe Dumbik.
Okay. Actually, Sonia, do you mind if we pause?
It could have been Itzhak Moshe Dumbik.
Sonia, do you mind if we pause for one moment?
Okay.
All right,
It
I'm
could have been something in the building. I don't know, but I didn't hear it.
Okay. Hopefully it won't come back. Okay, so you were just telling us the names of your mother's parents. What do you know about them?
I don't know very much about my maternal grandmother because she died when my mother was 10. And my mother always spoke highly of her and how much she missed her. My mother's father, I do know, there were different names given to what he did, and I'm not sure whether they're Yiddish or Polish. He was called a Marshalik or a Batchen, and he was someone who went, now I heard a noise, but I don't know what it was. He went to weddings, and I don't know if they had bar mitzvahs in those days in that country, but I know he went to weddings and he would sing songs and tell jokes. And that's how he made a very meager living. I I like that idea because I've always been known for my sense of humor and like to entertain and like to think that I inherited that from my maternal grandfather.
Do you know how your parents met?
Yes. Um, it's two different stories. My mother left Pilz when she was a youngster because her mother died when she was 10. Her father remarried shortly thereafter to a woman who had a daughter of her own. And this woman did not care for my mother. And to make a long story short, my mother ended up living with a wealthy uncle and his wife and son and daughter in Warsaw. So she was living in Warsaw. My father, when he was 14, illegally ran across the border between Poland and Germany because he felt there were more opportunities for him in Germany. So neither one of them, grew up totally in Pilz. When my father was about 18 and my mother was about 19, he came home to Pilz to visit his mother, and my mother came home to Pilz to visit her father. And a matchmaker who was a relative of my mother's introduced them.
Did they ever talk about life in Pilz or share any memories from their youth?
Oh, yes. I can't say, not my father, not because he was not much of a talker. But in fact, one time I started to write down my mother's memories of life in Pilz. And she told me some stories and I wrote them down, but I didn't keep up with that. But they certainly talked about it, and I went there to visit in 2001.
When you went to visit, did you know whereabouts they lived?
No, I just wanted to go to the town. But some woman that I spoke to suggested to me that I try to find out some information about my family when I went there, which hadn't occurred to me because they had left so many decades ago. But because this person suggested that, when I went to Pilz, I did make an effort to get some information about my parents.
Do you know what kind of education your parents received in Poland?
Basically, neither one had any education. My mother had a little bit because she told me she had uncles who were teachers and she could sit in on their classes. How much of that she did, I don't know. My father had absolutely no education and he was illiterate.
Did either of your parents have any siblings?
I don't know much about them. I know that my mother had a sister and a brother. I don't know anything about my father's siblings, but my mother had some siblings.
Do you remember meeting any cousins when you were young?
Never. We were living in Germany and they were living in Poland. And my father used to go periodically as he was doing better financially. He would return to Poland with some money and arrange for a poor Jewish girl to get married because he would provide the dowry. So we went back to Poland once in a while, but that's all I know.
And do you have any siblings?
I had a brother.
And was your brother older or younger?
He was 14 years my senior.
Were you close growing up, even though he was quite a bit older?
I can't say we were close because he was so much older than I that he was more in the position of taking care of me like a father did than he was like a brother. But he certainly did spend time with me and took me places and took care of me, but it was more like a father. Of course, there were times when he tried to tell me what to do, and I would tell him he's not my father, and that I had a father. But he was a good brother, but our relationship was more like someone taking care of someone else.
What did he try to tell you to do? Do you remember?
Oh, he got very upset when he learned that I was planning to go to law school. And he was actually more old-fashioned than my parents were. And just before I was going to leave for law school, we lived near each other at that time in Long Beach, Long Island, on the same street. And he came over and spent about 2 hours ranting and raving why I shouldn't go to law school, which I thought was very funny because my father really never told me what to do, or if he did, I didn't do it. And I felt certainly my brother had no business telling me what to do. So he spent these 2 hours carrying on why I shouldn't go to law school. And when he left, I packed my bag and left for law school.
And what were your parents like? Could you, describe their personalities a little bit?
Yeah. In the following sense, they were really opposites. My father was not into socializing with other people. And my mother was into socializing with other people, very much so. I don't think she was always sincere about it, but she was into it. My father could care less. One time, I remember I had a blind date, and the guy said to me as we were going out, he said he noticed the fishing rods around my house. My father was a terrific amateur fisherman. So this blind date said to me, whose fishing rods are those? I said, well, they're my father's, of course. So the guy says to me, that's funny. I asked your father if they were his, and he said no. So, I was puzzled. And the next day I said to my father, did you say that those rods weren't yours? My father said, yeah. I said, why did you say that? He said, if he's too stupid to figure out that those are my fishing rods, I'm not going to tell him. So that was his type of socialization. My father had really one driving interest in life, and that was to support his family and to take care of his family. And there was nothing he wouldn't have done to accomplish that. He wasn't bothered by any codes of morality. I don't think he ever learned that. He just wanted to support his family and take care of his family. There was nothing he wouldn't have done for me. While I say that, I think neither one of my parents ever said to me, I love you. But if I had said to them, go and cut off your arms and legs because it will help me for 5 minutes, they would have both done it. And I knew that. And so I didn't need them telling me that they loved me because I knew they were utterly devoted to me.
What did your father do for work?
Well, his first job was in Pils, was working for a tailor, and the tailor made clothes for men, and my father would deliver them. Then my father left for Germany when he was 14, and he got work in like a tailor shop, learning to be a tailor, and he was very good at that. My father could make a man's coat, a man's suit. There was nothing he couldn't make from scratch. So he learned all that. And then he went into business by himself and for himself. When I was born, he was renting and running a men's clothing store in Berlin, and well-to-do.
Do you remember the name of his store in Berlin?
Yeah, it was, I think, when he was in Berlin, he used the first name Zygmunt. And I think it was, but I have a picture of him and some of the employees in front of the store, although I don't know what album it's in. I think it was called the Zisha Pressman Men's Clothing Store, but I'd have to look it up.
And did you ever visit the store?
As a child, I was 5 when we left Germany, also, and I have no recollection of anything before I was 6 and came to America. So I don't have any recollection of ever visiting the store. My mother and brother worked in the store, but we had maids in the house. So my guess is that the maids took care of me in the house, and my mother and brother went with my father and worked in the store.
Do you remember the names of the maids that worked in the house?
Absolutely not.
And you don't remember the house, what it looked like inside, or
I have no idea what
rooms?
it looked like, but I have the address because I wrote a memoir. And when I was writing it, I often called my brother for information and he gave it to me. So in my memoir is the address where we lived when we left Berlin. We had previously lived in Frankfurt am Main, where my brother was born. Those are the only 2 places I know where we lived. We may have lived in other places, I don't know of them. I only know of Frankfurt am Main because my brother was born, and Berlin there, and Berlin where I was born.
So what are some of your earliest memories?
My earliest memory is really starting school in New York City, in the Bronx. But I previously know, I know, because we have pictures, that I went to kindergarten in Antwerp, Belgium, but I have no recollection of it.
What about, do you remember what your parents or your brother told you about moving from Berlin to Belgium?
Absolutely. And it was my brother who told me this. And my brother started to keep a diary in 1932. And he began keeping it in Berlin. And then he kept it when we continued to keep it when we were in Antwerp, and ended it in 1935 when we were living in the Bronx. And the original of that diary and the English translation that he did with his granddaughter, Debbie Linnick, is in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he kept it in German shorthand, but he translated it into English with the help of his granddaughter, Debbie Linnick. And the original diary and an English translation are in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I also have a copy of the English version, which I've read a number of times, and it is also available online.
So your brother really saw what was going on politically in Germany.
It is amazing to me how early my brother saw it. I know that the minute that Hitler was named Vice Chancellor of Germany by Germany's President von Hindenburg, my brother immediately saw the threat to the Jews, and he began importuning my father. That happened on January 30th, 1933, when Hitler was named Vice Chancellor. And my brother immediately began importuning my father that we had to leave Germany.
Do you know if your parents experienced any anti-Jewish sentiment before you left Germany?
Yes, in a couple of ways. First of all, my brother knew of some incidents that happened to people we knew involving the Nazis and Jewish people. My brother himself was involved in an incident where I think he was driving, he was like on a bicycle and a cab hit him. And he was not seriously hurt, but he was knocked to the floor, to the ground and bleeding. And he said a circle of people formed around him. Some of them he recognized. And they were, instead of being sympathetic to him because he was hit by a cab, they were calling him a Jew and they were saying negative things about him. But the biggie that happened was that a group of thugs, Hitler thugs, came to our store, and some of them had previously worked, some of the men had previously worked as salesmen for us, and they came in the store to rob it. And my brother ran to his office and closed the door and called the police. And that store used to be a bank, and there was a vault in the back. And my father and brother were afraid that the thugs would lock them in the whole vault and rob the store. So my brother was able to call the police, and the police came and they chased out the thugs. But they said to my father, if such a thing happens again, not to call the police because they wouldn't come because we were Jews.
Did your family attend a synagogue?
I know that my parents went to a synagogue in the United States. I don't know that they ever belonged to one, but they would go like for the high holidays, high holy days. They would go on Friday nights, but they were not big synagogue goers. What they did in Germany with regard to that, I have no idea.
How would you describe your family's Jewish identity?
Very strong. But I can't tell you what they did to why I would say very strong, but I've always felt that I am Jewish in my bones. And I think my parents, I mean, just like my identity is tied up with being a woman, being a Jew. And I think my parents felt the same way. My mother was strictly kosher. She kept a kosher home, and it would be death to her if she ever had to eat non-kosher food. I'm not exaggerating. My father, on the other hand, liked to eat non-kosher food. But their Jewishness was not whether they ate kosher food or whether they went to a synagogue. I find it no different from my saying I'm a woman. That's what I am. That's what my body is. And that's what being Jewish is to me. And I'm sure that's what it was to my parents. An intrinsic part of who they were.
Do you remember celebrating any particular Jewish holidays when you were young?
Well, I'm sure we celebrate isn't the right word, but we follow the holidays, the Jewish holidays. We would go to synagogue for the high holy days. I remember as a child, I used to fast on Yom Kippur. So I think they didn't have didn't have Jewish educations. Didn't go to Hebrew school, things like that, I don't believe. But we were certainly cognizant of all the holidays. And I would not go to school on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that kind of thing.
So I know your father wasn't very social, but did your parents have any Jewish friends or Jewish community that would come by the house or that you would go visit?
They had individual friends, and they were all Jewish. I don't know anything about in Germany, but my parents in Germany were well-to-do. My mother had beautiful clothes. I can tell from some of the pictures. They had maids. They went to the theater. Say again what you were asking me. Well, but I don't think they had friends, but I don't think they had friends like I would have friends in this country. I think my friends were a much more important part of my life than my parents' friends were to their lives. I think to my parents, the important thing was the nuclear family. And beyond that, I am sure they had friends, but it was a casual kind of thing.
Do you remember any particular birthday celebrations when you were growing up?
Well, I remember one that I didn't have in the United States when we lived in the Catskill Mountains of New York. My parents, my mother used to have a birthday party for me every year. And this happened in Woodridge, New York, a small town in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And my mother used to have a birthday party for me every year. So one year I said to her, I didn't want to have a birthday party because I knew these two girls. They were in school with me, and they came from a more well-to-do family. The older one was called Joyce, and the younger one was called Rosalind. I can't believe I'm remembering their names. And their parents owned a hotel in Woodridge, and that was a big deal. But those two girls used to come to my birthday party every year, and they were probably the wealthiest girls that came, and they never brought me a present. So I said to my mother, I didn't want to have a birthday party this particular year, and I don't know when it was, because those girls always came and never, those two girls always came and never brought a present. So I didn't want to have a party. So my mother said, are you sure you don't want? No, I said, I don't want to have a party because I don't want them coming and not bringing a present. So that year, my mother didn't have a birthday party for me. And I felt terrible and started to cry. My mother had to take me downtown, which wasn't much in Woodridge, and bought me a dress. So I started to feel a little better. So that was what I remember with regard to birthday parties.
And how old were you for that party?
Oh, I don't know. I was 6 when we came to America. I was probably about 7.5 when we moved to the mountains. So I could have been 10 or something like that.
What do you know about how your family left Belgium to come to New York?
Well, I know a lot because my mother talked to me and my parents talked to me, more my mother, and because my brother kept his diary, which told the whole story. So as I mentioned, my brother wanted my father to take the family out of Germany, and my father refused and said it was ridiculous and that Hitler and his thugs would blow over and everything would be fine. So my brother decided he was going to leave by himself. He wanted to go to England, but he couldn't get a visa. So he went to Antwerp, Belgium, where we had cousins. The male cousin's name was David Mendelsohn. I don't know his wife's name. And so my brother left by himself and went to Belgium and initially lived with those cousins and then found a place for himself. So he went, I think, in May of 1933. And he was, of course, in touch with my parents. And my mother asked him to come back to Germany. She said that things were getting better and that they needed him in the store. So my brother was a very good son, and he said he didn't want to return to Germany because he'd read in the paper that when Jews who have left Berlin return, the Nazis are waiting for them at the railroad station in Berlin and they're never seen again. But he said to my parents, if you order me to return, I will return. So my parents said, we order you to return. And my brother was going to return. And then I do not know, I'm sorry, I blame myself all the time for not asking my father what made him change his mind. But he changed his mind. He told me he sat down in a small room with 3 or 4 Nazis, and he gave, my father had just bought recently for investment purposes a building with 40 apartments and 4 stores as an investment. And my brother used to collect the rents there. So my father gave the Nazis that building, our home, our store, and they gave us a fraction of the value, and they said we could go. So about June or July of 1933, we left Berlin and came to Antwerp.
And how long were you in Antwerp?
I should say that neither my brother nor I nor my parents had the legal right to be in Antwerp. My brother had like a 3-day visitor's visa or whatever, and the rest of us had nothing. And we were in Antwerp from July of 33 until April of 34. During that entire time, my father was trying to get into some kind of business venture where he and my brother could be employed, but nothing that he tried worked out. And he was continually blaming my brother for taking us out of Berlin, where he had a business and a way to make a living, and just continually blaming my brother for that. And my brother really never answered back. And he just wrote in his diary that he hoped someday that my father would realize he had done the right thing. And in Belgium, there was a man named Robert de Foy, who was head of an organization called the Sûreté Publique. And that was like our FBI. And he did not want foreign businessmen coming to Belgium and competing with Belgian businessmen. So my brother was running around trying to get us the legal permission to remain in Belgium, but this Robert de Foy would not grant it. And he instead wanted to deport us to Poland, where my parents hadn't lived in 20 years. And Robert de Foy went to the mayor of Antwerp, a wonderful man named Camille Huysmans, who later became Prime Minister of Belgium. And he asked Huysmans to deport us to Poland. Camille Huysmans was a socialist. He was sympathetic to the plight of Jewish immigrants in Belgium, and he refused to deport us. So Robert de Foy went to the federal police in Belgium with an order to deport us to Poland. And people in our house told us that when the federal police came to deport us, we were on a Red Star Line ship called the SS Westernland II en route to the United States.
Do you recall anything about that trip? Do you remember the boat ride?
My first memory is of going to school in New York, in the Bronx. So I have pictures of myself on the boat with my parents, but I have no recollection of it. I do know that we were all seasick the whole time, which was about 10 days.
So when you arrived into New York in the Bronx, did you have any family or relatives in the States?
Well, first of all, we didn't arrive in the Bronx. We arrived in New York City. We had relatives in Brooklyn. And in fact, these relatives years earlier had sent us papers urging us to come to the United States. But my father was a successful businessman in Germany. Why would he come to the United States? So we never gave that any thought. Now, not now, but when we were coming to the United States, it was in my father's mind that when we arrived here, he would go into business with one of these cousins that we had in Brooklyn. But 2 weeks before we arrived, that cousin died. So while we were in touch with those people and other family members and other people, we didn't really have anybody that was waiting for us here.
So what do you recall about the Bronx?
I don't recall it. Well, I recall a little bit about the Bronx, but I don't know whether I recall it or I know it because I've written about it and talked about it. When we came to the United States, an organization named HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, helped us find an apartment. My father talked about them all his life because we didn't need any financial help. My father had been sending money out of Germany for years, so we had money when we arrived in the United States. But anyway, HIAS helped us find an apartment in the Bronx. We lived at an address called 500 Southern Boulevard. And I started to go to kindergarten there already, although I'd already attended kindergarten in Antwerp. And the way I learned to speak English, my brother knew English. And he also studied it had previously studied it, and he studied it when we were in Antwerp, went to school. But nobody else knew English in the family. So at 500 Southern Boulevard, there was like a circular garden on the ground. And the children used to hang out there, the children who lived in the building. And when I heard an English word, I would go upstairs to my brother and I would tell him the English word and he would tell me the German equivalent. And that's how I learned English. And then I went off to kindergarten.
Did you interact or were you friends with any of the other children in the building?
I have no recollection of anything. I don't know. I
And-
think while we were living in New York, I had a Chinese friend, young girl who was my age and who was Chinese, but that's all I remember.
Was this a friend from school?
I have no idea.
And do you remember much about the school, what it was like?
Nothing, except I remember that my mother used to make me wear knee-high stockings. It's not called stocking, knee-high hose. And the other children were all wearing anklets. So I was upset because I had to wear knee-high hose. But that's all I remember. And at some point I skipped a grade also. I don't remember where that was. It must have been in the Bronx that at somewhere along the line I skipped a grade, but we weren't there that long, only about a year and a half.
And where did you move after the Bronx?
We moved to the Catskill Mountains of New York to a small town called Woodridge.
And What were your first impressions of the Catskills or Woodbridge?
Not with a B, with a D.
Woodridge.
I had no idea what my first impressions were. Went off to school. We were running my parents rented a house there for 5 years. In Yiddish, it's called a kochalein, which means cook for yourself, as opposed to a hotel where you get your meals served. That house, which we rented for 5 years, the English word would be, it was a rooming house. And we would rent rooms to people, mostly all from New York City or the boroughs, and they would come from Memorial Day, which happens to be my birthday, it was May 30th, until Labor Day. That was the season. And let's say there was a family of a husband and wife and 2 children. So they would rent a room. So the husband would be in New York City at his job all week. The wife would be in the room with the 2 children, and she would go downstairs to the ground floor to prepare and eat their meals. And every family would have like a table and chairs and some kind of stove and an ice box. And I remember ice used to, for a big block of ice, you would pay 25 cents. And then on weekends, the husbands would come and be with their wives for the weekends and then go back to New York City. And that went on from Memorial Day to Labor Day. And we rented those rooms. That's how we made our living. And I drew up the contracts. I was maybe 10 or so, and I was drawing up the contracts because my English was better than that of my parents.
And why did your family decide to move from the Bronx to Woodridge?
That's a more interesting question than you would think. While we were living in the Bronx, we once went, like everybody, to get away from the heat of New York City's summer. We went to the Catskills for a couple of weeks for a vacation. And when we came home, my father was not at that, and maybe most men were that way at that time. If he was thinking about a decision, he did not sit down and discuss it with my mother. Even though she was a strong woman in her own way, he would announce it. So when we came back from the Catskills, he announced to my mother that we were going to move to the Catskills. In New York, he had gone into business with a partner, and he had a store with the partner in New York City. But he did not like the pace of life in New York City. In Berlin, he used to open the store, and then he'd come home for lunch and have lunch at home, then go back to the store, and then come back in the evening, and he had time to rest or take a nap. And he did not like the pace of life in New York. And he liked better what he saw of the small town life in the Catskills. So he announced to my mother that we were moving to the Catskills. All their lives, whenever my father went someplace different from where we were living, he wanted to sell our place and move there. And my mother always wanted to stay where she was. So my mother said, "Are you kidding? I'm going to move from this city, New York, to that small town in the mountains? No way." So my father was not a big conversationalist. He put on his jacket and he left the house. And my brother said to my mother, "I don't like the way he looks, and I'm going to follow him." So my father went to the Harlem River and walked in. He was going to kill himself because my mother said she's not going to the Catskills. So my brother called bystanders to get help. They called an ambulance. My brother went after my father, pulled him out of the water. My brother said that by that time, that my father's eyes were rolling around in his head and he didn't know who he was anymore. And the bystander said that there was an ambulance, that my father should be taken to the hospital. And my brother said, no, he's going to bring him home. So we brought my father home, soaking wet. And my mother took one look at him and said, all right, we'll go to the Catskills. So that's how, those are the circumstances in which we moved, under which we moved to the Catskills.
Do you remember what it was like getting settled in the Catskills for you and your family?
I remember that once my mother went to the school that I attended and gave a talk about our lives, being immigrants and so on. I remember being, I'm trying to think whether we were still in Woodridge or we were already in Monticello. I remember that I was in the 3rd grade, I was like the teacher's pet. And her name was Miss Elliott. And I used to sit with her when she graded the papers. And I mean, she would sit in a, like a desk, like a student sat in, and she would grade the papers and I would sit next to her. That's about all I remember, but I was always good in school. I always liked school. I never had a problem in school. I always got good grades. That's about what I remember.
Did you have a favorite subject when you were in school?
Not that I can think of. I think I liked all the subjects. I don't think I was particularly into the scientific subjects, but I liked English. Always liked English. But school was always, I did my homework. I studied what I had to, but it was never a problem for me.
Did you have any favorite books?
I know that I had a favorite book, but there was one book that I cried after I read it. It was about a horse. I used to know the name of it. It was about a horse that died. And it's a well-known book. I can't remember the name of it at this moment, but I cried for about a month after reading that book because that horse died. It really affected me. Other than that, I can't remember. But I was always a reader. I was always reading something or other.
Did you have any hobbies or activities that you like to do outside of school?
I'm trying to think. Nothing comes to mind, really. But I remember when I was a child, we started going to Miami Beach because, so long story, but we started spending the winters in Miami Beach. And when I was 10 years old, I had a poem printed in the Miami newspaper. I wrote a poem about the dew on the ground, and they printed it. And that was the first time I ever had anything published. Beyond that, I don't remember.
Did you continue to write poetry?
Yes, but not in more recent years. But I have somewhere in the house a whole book of poems that I wrote. I never did any of that. That was the only poem I ever had published. But I did go through a stage where I wrote a lot of poems.
And do you remember any of your friends or close friends when you were in school in Woodridge?
Yes. Well, really, I'm thinking one girl was in my class. She was not a close friend. Her name was Dorothy Jankel. And she came from a family of 11. And it was a very poor family. I just knew her. She was in my class. I see her now. She had a certain kind of like a fuzzy hair. And everybody was always afraid of catching lice from her because I don't know why, but that was a concern. And then I knew those two girls whose parents owned the hotel. I think it was called the Atlantic Hotel. And then when we moved to Monticello, I had more friends. It was a bigger town. And I was getting older, so I remember more friends from Monticello than I do from Woodridge.
And when you lived in Woodridge, who all lived in your home?
My parents and I. What do you mean?
Did your brother live with you, or?
Well, my brother, when we came to America, so he must have been 19 or 20. And when he was 24, he got married. And so he lived with us till he got married. I don't remember what he did. But then when he got married, my father bought him a candy store in Long Beach, Long Island, so he could make a living for his wife. So he left the house when he was 24.
Were there other Jewish families that that your family socialized with at all in the Catskills?
I'm sure there were, but I can't remember who they are now. But there would have been other families with whom they socialized. And you're right in talking about Jewish families, because in those days, in our circles, Jews and non-Jews didn't, at least where we lived, didn't socialize with each other. Their friends would have been Jews. And they would have been people doing similar things to what we were doing, but I don't know who they were.
Do you remember any toys that you played with as a child?
I know I had dolls, and I played Monopoly, but not. That was some years later. Like when I was in high school, I used to love to play Monopoly. I played cards. In the Catskills, the men used to come and they'd play gin rummy and they'd play pinochle. But I didn't. When we were in Monticello, I played mahjong. We had wooden mahjong games for it cost $1 a game, and I would play with the women at the in our bungalow colony that we had at that time.
Were there any theaters or restaurants or any kind of places people would go?
Um, there were certainly restaurants in Monticello, but my parents tended to eat home all the time. And years later, when I urged them to eat out, and my mother would have liked to eat out, my father never liked going out to eat. And it would always be a problem because when we go out to a restaurant, my mother and father would have a fight because my mother would want my father to leave a tip. He didn't want to leave a tip, and or he would claim that he got sick when he ate in a restaurant. So those their going out to restaurants were always fraught with problems. My father liked to eat at home. My mother was an excellent cook, so that's usually where we ate. In fact, the name of my book comes from something like that, because as I was growing up as a teenager, I would sometimes get invitations to go to the home of a friend for dinner. My mother was never comfortable with that because she felt that when she cooks for me, she's cooking with love, she's cooking kosher, she's cooking with fresh food, and she didn't know what I might be getting on the outside. So she would say to me, eat first. She wanted me to have dinner home first before I went out to dinner at somebody else's home. And she would say to me, eat first, you don't know what they'll give you. And that became the title of my memoir.
What were some of your favorite dishes that she made?
Oh, Oh, well, you know, when I was younger, my mother was always trying to fatten me up. Because I think the style in Poland was for girls to be more buxom and more little on the chubby side. And I always wanted to be slim. So no matter what my mother served me, I would immediately cut it in half and eat half. So I love eating now, and I've got a wonderful appetite. People who eat with me can't believe what I eat because I'm a small person. And recently we had a Passover dinner here where I live, and the people of both sides of me were saying that they couldn't believe what I was putting away because I'm so small. But when I was younger, I did not have an appetite because my mother was always trying to fatten me up. And once a year, I got taken to the doctor. And my parents said to the doctor, "What is wrong with her? She's not putting on any weight." I was perfectly normal weight, but my parents wanted me to be heavier. So the doctor would always say, "She's fine, go home." And this happened every year. So well, my mother was a wonderful cook. I did not appreciate eating in those days. So I would eat whatever she served, and she made everything good. I remember that where I am now, we have a cook, a male cook, executive chef, who was born in Cuba, but came here at the age of 3 months. And he cooks kosher meals here for the residents of the senior residents where I live in independent living. And I have told him some of the things my mother made, and he's making it. And one of the things she made that was delicious was she made a stuffed cabbage, but not stuffed with meat. It was stuffed with raisins and rice and things like that. And our cook has made that once or twice. But I wasn't into eating in those days.
Was there anything she made that was just like for a very, very special occasion?
Not that I can think of. Everything she made was good. She made chopped liver, which I like to this day, but I'm a vegan, so the chef here makes delicious vegan chopped liver for me. But my mother used to make the regular chopped liver. At that time, I wasn't a vegan. I like that. I like stuff with onions. She used to make eggs with onions, which was for breakfast, which was a dish that I like. Now I don't eat eggs because I'm a vegan. I'm trying to think. She would make matzah brai, which is something for Passover, for breakfast. Whatever she made was good, but as I said, I had no interest in eating. I wanted to go off and read a book or do something more interesting.
Could you describe a bit your home in Woodridge?
I can't. I have no idea. We had an apartment, but that's all I can remember.
And then how old were you when you left Woodridge?
Well, I think we came to the United States. I was a month short of being 6 years old, and then I think we lived in the Bronx for about a year and a quarter, a year and a half. We moved to Woodridge, so by that time I would have been 7.5, I guess. And in Woodridge we were for 5 years. Then we moved to Monticello, a bigger community, about 12 miles away. So we moved to Monticello. That would have been 1941. And I was in Monticello until 1946 when I went to college.
And what was your life like in Monticello?
Well, my father bought 50 acres of land, a mile and a quarter out of downtown Monticello. So that wasn't a great thing for me because we lived a mile and a quarter out of town, and I could not socialize with my classmates who were in town. So I was really isolated and lonesome there. My father bought these 50 acres of land on the Port Jervis Road, Route 42. And he built there about 25 bungalows, a swimming pool, a handball court, a small general store. And we rented those bungalows out for the summer.
And Sonia, I think we'll take a break now if that's okay with you. We're at about an hour.
All right.
Is that all right? Okay, great. So Moira, we'll take a little break.
We are recording.
Okay. So just before the break, Sonia, you were telling us about the bungalow colony in Monticello.
Right.
And describe it had a swimming pool and handball courts. Did you play in the pool or use the handball courts when you lived there?
I must have gone in the pool, but the problem was I was in a difficult position because I was the daughter of the owners. So I wasn't like there were kids there who came from New York City and rented a bungalow with their parents for the summer, but I was not one of them. I was the owner's daughter. And if they had any difficulty with my father, then they didn't like me. So I was in a difficult position because of what I've just told you. So I don't think it was an especially happy time for me. It wasn't an unhappy time for me, but and then I was involved with my parents and again drawing up the contracts and running the colony. I didn't have much of a childhood. I was mostly involved with my parents and they're making a living and helping them.
And what all were your responsibilities? You wrote the contracts?
Yeah, I would write the contracts for the summer. Nothing complicated, like a page or so, I'm guessing, where I just said these people are renting this bungalow and they can come on Decoration Day and they have to leave Labor Day and whatever one day, and this is what they have to pay. And no complicated stuff, but whatever it is, I would draw them up and then everybody would sign.
And did your mother work on the colony as well?
She did. It was amazing to me what she did, because in Germany, by the time I was born, my parents were well-to-do and they had servants in the house. And as I mentioned, my mother had some beautiful clothes and they went to places for vacations out of Berlin and things like that. But at the end of the summer, she would hire cleaning women and she would work with them and go from bungalow to bungalow and clean those bungalows. She did that. And I never heard her say things were better for her in Germany. I never heard her say that. They used to know some other people who had been in Europe, and they used to carry on about how well-to-do they were in Europe and how much better things were there for them. I never heard my parents say anything like that. My parents just moved ahead with what they had to do.
Did your parents talk at all about any memories in Europe or anything when you were living in New York?
I feel like I know a lot about their lives from their conversations among each other and to me. First of all, to my knowledge, they never kept secrets from me. Like I'm always hearing, I know Yiddish. I can't speak it, but I understand it. But I'm always hearing people say they wish they knew Yiddish, but their parents used to speak Yiddish when they didn't want them to know what they were talking about. I hear that all the time. And people say they wish they knew Jewish, Yiddish, but their parents only spoke it when they didn't want them to know what was going on. I cannot imagine my parents ever keeping anything from me. They never did. I was intimately involved with their business, whatever business, and the renting the kachale, renting the bungalows, and I was a part of that unit, not as a child.
So in the home, did you mostly speak Yiddish or did you speak English as well?
People ask me what I spoke when I first was born. Well, not when I was born, I was used when they were born, but when I was a child, I don't really know. But whatever my parents spoke, I understood. And I'm guessing that my parents spoke Yiddish and German in the home. I don't know. Whatever they spoke, I understood it. My mother also knew Polish. My father didn't seem to know, and she knew a little Russian. So I don't know I think in the United States, I don't really know. I think in the United States, they must have spoken English and Yiddish. But as I said, whatever it was they spoke, I always answered in English in the United States, and they spoke whatever they spoke, and everybody understood everybody else.
Did they ever talk with you about politics or share any of their political views?
My mother, no, I don't think she had any political views. My father used to be very cynical about what he read in the newspapers. And he was cynical about politicians. And he was brighter than I was in those days, because whatever you taught me in school and whatever I read in the newspapers, I thought was the truth. I believed everything. And my father used to disparage politicians. You can't believe them, blah, blah, blah. And I was just shocked when he did that, because whatever anybody said, I believed it. It wasn't until many years later that I became more sophisticated with regard to politicians. But my father was always on to them. He used to read, he learned to read the Yiddish paper when we were in Belgium, because he heard that you had to be able to read in some language to be admitted in the United States. I don't know whether that's true or not, but my father believed that. So we had a friend that came over and taught my father to read printed Yiddish. And when we came to the United States, my father was always reading the foreword, which I'm reading to this day. But he read it in Yiddish and I read it now in English, but I used to be able to read it in Yiddish too. But he really read that paper.
Did you discuss the paper together?
No, I don't think so. The only thing we discussed was the foreword had and has recently reinstituted it. They had a column called the Bintel Brief, which means a packet of letters. And there have been books written about the Bintel Brief. There have been plays about the Bintel Brief to this day. The Bintel Brief, which, as I said, means a packet of letters, was immigrant Jews who came to the United States and didn't know which end was up, used to write to the editor of the foreword, and the Yiddish word was redactor, and they used to ask the editor how to handle problems that they faced as immigrants. And the editor, who had, I'm sure, no training in how to deal with such problems, would answer them. And these were very popular. This was a very popular feature in a paper. And in my family, we used to read it. I used to read it, and we would talk about that. And some of those letters and the answers have become famous because as I said, it's been the fodder for books and plays and musical. And I remember one letter, but I used to remember more, where a man wrote to the editor saying he didn't know what to do. He was going with a woman who had dimples. And he heard that if you marry somebody that has dimples, you're going to die. So he was in love with this woman, but he was afraid to marry her because she had dimples. And he was asking the editor what to do.
What were some of the topics of conversation that you had with your parents, either during mealtime or when you were just together over the weekend at the house?
I don't know that we would ever, I think, sit down and have, depending on whatever came up, we would be talking about. Can't think of anything in particular, that when I decided I wanted to go, oh, that's my phone, I'll hang up on it. Hello, I'm in the middle of an interview.
I'm recording now.
Okay. What we would talk about is like periodically at the beginning of a school year, my mother would go with me to a nearby town or to New York City. We'd go to Orbach's, and there were two stores. One was Orbach's, and now I forgot the other one. Ibby Klein's, I think. We would go to a nearby town like Hempstead, or we would go to New York City, and my mother would go shopping with me for the school year. So before she went shopping with me, my father would carry on. Why is she taking me shopping? The house is full of clothes for me, which he called schmattes, which is the Yiddish word for rags. If you want to speak disdainfully about clothes, you call them schmattes. So he would say I had so many schmattes, and they were all over the house, and what did I need more clothes for? So he would carry on. My mother and I would then go shopping, and we would buy all kinds of things that I needed for the school year. We would come home, we would show my father what we had bought, and he would say, that's nice. And that was it. Frequently, I meet young women who say, they're impressed with the fact that I was a lawyer. They said they would have liked to go to law school, but their father wouldn't let them, or they would have liked to marry this guy, but their father wouldn't let them. And I always hear these things, and my father was a tough guy, but he never said anything to me that I had to pay attention to, because there were no consequences if I didn't do what he wanted. I don't remember ever that my father hit me. I remember when I was a little girl, my mother hit me. I don't remember my father ever hitting me. And I was never punished for anything. So I grew up knowing that I could do, my difficulty was deciding what it is I wanted to do. And once I decided what I wanted to do, I didn't care what anybody else thought. And my parents were so exceptional, because when I did something that they didn't want me to do, they paid for it. They paid for me to go to college. They didn't want me to go. They paid for me to go to law school. Didn't want me to go. Not only did they pay for me to go to law school, but I had a difficult situation when I went to law school. I had 2 or 3 roommates, and we had an apartment. And one of the roommates obviously was some kind of a mental case, because one morning I woke up and she was up and she was carrying on, because she said that she had left her hairbrush in a certain place on the dresser, and she found it that morning in a different place, and I must have moved it. And why did I move her hairbrush? Well, of course, I didn't know what the hell she was talking about. So I took to sleeping on the floor in the living room, because I didn't want to deal with this. So my father came to visit me, And he saw that I was sleeping on the floor in the living room, didn't say a word to me. They were living in Long Beach, Long Island at the time. My brother was there too. And my father went back to Long Beach and said to my mother, we have to sell our home and move to Miami Beach. And my mother said, why is that? And my father said, because I don't have a good setup with this Michiganer, which means crazy roommate, and that they had to buy a house in Miami Beach so I can come live with them while I'm going to law school, which they didn't want me to go to, and for which they were paying. So that's what they did. My brother was a realtor by that time. So within 2 weeks of returning from Miami Beach, my parents had given the house to my brother to sell, moved to North Miami Beach, bought a house there so I could live with them while I was going to law school. So those are the kinds of parents I had. And I didn't have to be afraid of them. And I didn't have to do what they told me. On the other hand, I never went and did anything crazy. You know, I was leading a perfectly respectable life. It wasn't the life they wanted. They wanted me to get married when I was 17 or 18 and have a family. That's what they knew. But whatever it was I was doing, they were going to support.
When was it that you decided you wanted to go to college? Did you know when you were young?
No, I had absolutely, well, let me tell you something that I knew and then about going to college. From the time I was 10, something like 10, I looked back over my life and I saw that my life had been saved on a good many occasions. First of all, I haven't discussed it with you, but my mother had 7 abortions before I was born. And she planned to have one with me, but the doctor was out of town. And she was going to go to her second abortionist. And my father said, let it be already. So it was a fluke that I was born. Then my life was saved when we left Germany early. My life was saved when we left Antwerp and weren't deported to Poland, and was also saved by our not being given permission to remain in Belgium, which we wanted because he'd probably been killed there. And then we were admitted to the United States at a time when there was a window and we could come in later on. Anne Frank's father wanted to come to the United States in 1938. They were denied. So I knew all that. I put it together with the fact that I was bright. And I came to the conclusion that there was a reason that my life was saved, because there was something I was supposed to do in the world to make it better. I couldn't tell this to anybody because they would have thought I was some kind of nut. Because I was 10 years old. What would you think if a child came up to you and said her life was saved because she was supposed to do something to make the world a better place? So I couldn't breathe that to a soul, but that was in me. But beyond that, I took typing in high school, and I planned to be a secretary like other girls planned to be a secretary, because there were only a limited number of jobs that were suitable for women in those days. You could be a secretary or a file clerk, you could be a school teacher, you could be a telephone operator, you could perhaps be a performer, but you weren't going to be a senator or a congressman. You weren't going to be an airplane pilot. You weren't going to be a newspaper reporter. You weren't going to be one of the jobs that counted in the society. So I accepted that. That never gave it a thought. And so I planned to be a secretary. And then when I was in high school, you had a choice of 2 kind of majors. One was called college entrance, and one was called introduction to business. So I opted for introduction to business. And the teacher who was in charge of that was named Margaret Gallagher. And she knew me because she used to drive past where I lived to drive to school. And she used to pick me up sometimes. Instead of my taking the school bus, she would take me. And so I opted for the introduction to business school class, not class, program. And she came to me and said, you have to be in the college entrance. I said, I don't have any plans to go to college. She said, you need to be in the college entrance. So finally, I switched to college entrance because she was pressuring me to do that and telling me I needed to do that. I didn't have any interest in it. And then one time I was in the ladies' room in high school, and my friend Joan Rulin, who's a friend of mine to this day, came to me and said, do you plan to go to college? And I said, absolutely not, because I was an immigrant and came here and everything, when I would have graduated from high school, when I was to graduate from high school, I would have been 18. And most of my classmates were 17, would have been 17. So I said to this Joan Rulin, I can't go to college because I'd be too old when I graduated. I'd be 22 and too old. So no, I said, I have no bullshit. So Joan said to me, oh, she's going to go to college, this and that and everything. So I started to think, what's wrong with me? She has all these highfalutin ideas. She went to college for 1 year, came back, married a hometown boy, never left Monticello. She's still there. But I started to think about the fact that she was going to college, but I wasn't going to do anything about it. I had never seen a college in my life. I didn't know what it was. So I had a classmate named Jake Nemerson. His father was an optometrist in Monticello. And Jake came to me one day and he said that he's going to a nearby town called Middletown, which was 30 miles away. And he said he's going to take a scholarship exam there. And the exam costs $7. But if you win it, you get a scholarship to college. And he invited me to go with him. Now, I don't know why, because we were not any more friendly than anybody else in my class. I was one of the better students, and I graduated first in my class. I was valedictorian. But otherwise, I don't know why he went to me and asked me that. So I said to him, I don't know. If it costs $7, I have to ask my father. So I went to my father and I told him that Jake had invited me to go with him to Middletown to take this test. And test cost $7, but if you won the scholarship, it was a $400 scholarship. So my father misunderstood. He thought you paid $7 and you got $400. So he said, certainly, go and take that test. So I went with Jake Emerson to Middletown. It was called the George Lefevre Scholarship. And I was one of the ones that won. So I was real excited when I found out that I'd won the scholarship. And I went to tell my father, and he didn't understand what all the excitement was about, because that's how he had understood it in the first place. You put in $7 and you get 400. So since I had won that, I then learned that there was another scholarship to take. It was called the New York State Scholarship. So I went and took that one. I also won that one. So that got me started about thinking to go to college. And I applied to a smaller college called Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, and I was accepted. And then I applied to Cornell. I have no idea why, and I was accepted. So then I turned down Hartwick and decided to go to Cornell. So that's how I went, but I didn't have any idea what I was doing.
So I'm curious just to hear a little bit more about your high school experience. You were valedictorian
Yeah.
at top of your class. Who did you have favorite classes or any particular teachers that really inspired you?
I always liked my teachers. Well, Miss Gallagher played an important role in my life. And then I liked very much, we had a Latin teacher called Stuart Irwin Gay was his name. And he used to be called SIG, of his three initials. And he taught Latin and I loved it. And I must have taken 4 or 5 years of Latin with him. And when I went to Cornell, I thought I was going to major in languages because of my background and then because I liked Latin so much. And he used to give me grades like A+. And one time he gave me just a plain A or an A-. And I went to ask him why, what happened that I didn't get an A+. So I liked him very much. I don't think I ever had a teacher that I disliked. And I gave the valedictorian speech for the class. It was not a big class. It was 90 in the class. I gave the valedictorian speech. I remember my mother helping me with it. What do I remember? I was always a good student.
Do you remember anything that you said in your speech?
It was about something like the American way of life or something. It was about the United States. But other than that, I don't remember. But it was about the United States.
And you said you studied Latin. How many languages do you speak?
The only language that I really can speak is English. I love English. I love language, love writing, love reading. I understand Yiddish, not at a sophisticated level, but at a basic level, I understand Yiddish. I understand very elementary German. I've been back to Germany twice, and I picked it up when I was there. I remember the tour guide that we had on my second trip said to me, she saw how my German improved. She said to me, Sonia, if you'd be here another 2 weeks, you'd be fluent. So I picked up on that. My brother told me that when we were in Antwerp and I went to kindergarten, I used to think I spoke French there. He said I spoke Flemish, but I have no recollection of it whatsoever. So I really only know English and a little bit of Yiddish. But I'm now, a friend of mine recently, I love language, a friend of mine recently told me about a website, and now they send emails every day. It's called A Word a Day. And they send you every day, some man runs this, and he's from India. And every day they teach you the meaning of an English word and when it was first used and how it is used. And I like that very much. Unfortunately, I don't remember that much of what I'm learning there. I wish I could remember all the new words, but I still enjoy it. And I'm very good at editing. Like a friend of mine an American, but she now lives in London, and she writes books, among other things. And I read her book. I make all kinds of editorial comments where her English is wrong, or something is wrong with the sentence or something like that. I'm very good at that.
Who were your closest friends in Monticello?
One of my close friends was this Joan Rulin. And I went back a few years ago. I went back to Monticello because they were creating a wall of distinction of students, teachers, and administrative personnel. And I was in the inaugural group of 10 students or something like that. Or I don't know whether the 10 included students and others also. So I went back and stayed with Joan She got married, and her name is, and her last name is now Farrow. Joan Rulon Farrow. So she was a good friend of mine. I guess my best friend was a young girl, a student named Doris Smuckler. She was as bright as I was, or brighter, but she had a father who wouldn't send her to college. So she went later. She went in later years after she got married. She went to college, but her father wouldn't send her. Doris Smuckler was my best friend. For a while, I was friendly with classmate named Sylvia Kushner. Another friend of mine who later became a better friend. We both went to Cornell together. And after that, we became friends because she was not Jewish. And in those days, Jewish and non-Jewish didn't socialize. Her name was Marilyn Layton. She and Doris Smuckler were among the brightest ones in my class. And Marilyn, later known as Lynn Layton, went to Cornell when I went to Cornell. Well, we didn't become friends until many years later when I wrote to her. I saw her name in the Cornell Alumni News, and I wrote to her, and we were good friends for many years until she went to California, and I don't know, nobody's heard from her since then.
Did your friends ever come over to your home?
No, they, I don't know. I think that was just my parents' lifestyle, but they never invited people for dinner, or they never went to anybody else's home for dinner. And one time when I was going to, and I felt so bad about this, one time when I was going to law school, we were living in North Miami Beach, and this guy, his name was Steve, and I knew him very well. I can't think of his last name now. He was a bright student at the law school, came over to study with me for the bar. And Steve Lachine was his name, Lacheen, very bright guy. So we studied for the bar, and then it got to be 6 o'clock. So I invited him to stay for dinner, and he did. And then when he went home, my father said to me, you know, this isn't a hotel. And that's the only time in my whole life that I had anybody for dinner. And they were not sociable that way. It was just the nuclear family, and that was it.
You mentioned earlier a date that had come to pick you up. What was dating like in Monticello? Were you in high school, or was that later?
Went to high school there, maybe junior high, I don't know. I certainly didn't date much. I could maybe count on the fingers of one hand how many dates I had when I was going to high school. So that wasn't a big part of my life. Part of it was that I was a mile and a quarter out of town. And another thing, from the time I was 8, I was wearing the school had some kind of optometrist, somebody come and test the children, and they told me I should be wearing glasses. So I got glasses when I was 8 years old, and at that time, nobody was wearing glasses, except I was. And it gave me an inferiority complex. Now everybody wears glasses, but in those days they didn't. So dating was not a big part of my life.
You mentioned your family would take winter trips to Miami Beach.
Right.
What were those like? What do you remember about those trips?
Well, I'll tell you how that happened. When I guess when we were living in Woodridge, we had a doctor who was German and Jewish. His name was Fernhoff. And he had a daughter named Rosina Fernhoff. She was a beautiful young woman, and she later became a well-known actress in Israel. But anyway, he was our doctor, and I started to be very sick. I couldn't sleep at night, and I used to be coughing all the time and couldn't breathe. So Dr. Fernhoff diagnosed me with as having asthma. He was incorrect, but that's what he diagnosed. He couldn't help me. So he suggested to my parents that they take me to Miami Beach, that perhaps a warmer climate might help me. So I was only about 10. We started going to Miami Beach. And my mother had the sense to take me to an allergist. And he found that I was allergic to chicken and dust and milk and just about everything you could think of. And he told my mother to take me off all of those things, which she did. And then on her own initiative, little by little, she put me back on all those things. And I never was allergic or had hay fever or asthma ever again in my life. So that's why we started going to Miami Beach. So initially, the higher the streets were in Miami Beach, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. The higher in number the streets were, the more expensive they were, and the more higher class it was. So we started out renting a room. Oh, and Jews, I was told, were not really permitted beyond Fifth Street. Somebody told me years later, which there's a Jewish museum around Fifth Street, and they told me that Jews were not permitted beyond Fifth Street at that time. Not that there was a law, but that was the custom. But anyway, I remember we'd rent a room, and one time we rented a room, and my mother got up in the morning and went to the kitchen to make breakfast, and she saw people sleeping. Men were sleeping there. My mother was very meticulous. And she went to the landlady and said, I went to make breakfast and there were men sleeping in the kitchen. What is that? And the landlady said, this is the height of the season. You don't think that for what you paid me, you're going to have the kitchen to yourself. Well, my mother would never prepare a meal in a room where somebody was sleeping. So we moved out of there. We had paid a month's rent, which was $80. We lost that month's rent. We went someplace else where we rented and had privacy. So every winter we would go and rent a place like that and spend. So then this is funny. So then one winter I now would go to school. So what happened? I would start school in the Catskills in Monticello, then leave the school because we were going to Miami Beach for the winter, go to school in Miami Beach, and come back and finish with my class in Monticello. So one year when we did this, I had a cold. And my mother decided that the school was too much for me. And that's why I had this cold, which wouldn't go away. So she went to the school and told the principal or teacher, whatever, that she was taking me out of school because I was sick. The school was not agreeing with me. And nobody in the school said to her, you can't take a child out of school. She has to go to school. Everybody said, we wish you luck, goodbye, and so on. So I didn't go to school for a few months. We came back and I finished with my class in Monticello. So I had that kind of disjointed education because we went every year to Miami Beach.
Was it difficult for you at all to be going back and forth between schools?
It was difficult, not scholarly wise, but it was difficult because I was always a new kid. You know, here I'd be going to school in Monticello, but then we'd leave to go to Miami Beach. So I'd be with a new group of students. Then I'd come back, finish with the kids in Monticello or Woodridge. So I was always the outsider. I was also the outsider because we were immigrants. I was also the outsider because we lived out of town in Monticello. So I was really the outsider.
Were there any other children that you knew of that were immigrants or other families that were immigrants?
I'm sure that my family knew some of the people that were from Europe, but I did not. They were all Americans.
And what else did you do in Miami Beach? You were in school most of the time you were there,
When
but
I was in school, we would go to the beach. We would sit on the beach for hours, go swimming, that kind of thing. We would go to Jewish restaurants. That's about all I can think of. Drive around.
did your parents have any friends there?
Trying to think if we had friends, and I'm sure they did, but nothing comes to mind. We knew more people in the Catskills than we knew in Miami Beach, because there we were only for a few months. Our permanent residence was in the Catskills. My father was a fisherman. He was an amateur fisherman, so we went fishing a lot.
And would you and your mother go fishing with him?
No, I would later on. When I was going to law school, I used to love to go fishing with my father. He was a terrific fisherman, and he would also help me, you know, if I had to put on the bait, or if something got snagged in the line or something, he would always help me. So, and I would love to go fishing with my father. My mother, no. I still have in my father's rod and reel. I once went into a fishing store for something, and the man saw that rod and reel, and he wanted to buy it from me, as he said it's an antique. But I said I wasn't going to sell my father's rod and reel, and I still have it.
Did he catch fish for dinner for the family?
I'll tell you what he did. He used to catch a lot of, he didn't like fish, didn't like to eat fish. So he would catch the fish and give them to my mother, and she would bring them to neighbors to give them the fish. And one time a neighbor said to my mother she would appreciate it if my mother would clean the fish before she gave it to her. So my mother said to my father to stop bringing her fish, because the neighbors want her to clean the fish, and she's not about to do that for them. So then my father would make deals with other fishermen who weren't as good as he was, and he would come home with fruits and vegetables and baked goods that he said people gave him for the fish that he caught. Because my mother said, don't keep bringing this home, because I'm not going around cleaning fish for people. So then he would bring home vegetables, fruits, and things he said people gave it him for the fish. We don't know what happened. That's what he told us.
And so during this time, your brother is living in Long Beach.
Right.
Did he come to visit, or did you visit him much?
He didn't come to visit much as I can remember. But first of all, he had this candy store, which in the summertime, he would close it at 2 and open it at 6 a.m. So it was a tough business. He had it for many years. Then he studied to be a real estate agent and an insurance agent. And he started by putting a little table in his candy store where he would be a real estate agent and insurance agent. And then he became very successful as a real estate agent. He sold the candy store, but I think he had it about 16 years. He sold the candy store, and he opened a real estate office. And his daughter Miriam runs it to this day. She's a real estate agent. He was successful, she's successful, and she runs it to this day. So he didn't come to visit us, but we would often go to New York to the Jewish Theater, and we'd go to visit my brother in Long Beach. And eventually we moved to Long Beach.
Do you remember seeing anything in particular at the Jewish Theater?
Yeah. From the time I was a child, the Jewish Theater was on 2nd Avenue in New York. And from the time I was a child, we would drive into New York on a 90-mile trip and go to the Jewish Theater on 2nd Avenue. And everybody in that theater was 80 years old and I was 10. But now I look back on it with a great deal of fondness. And we saw stars like Menashe Skolnick is the one that I particularly remember. And there was a woman actress named Miriam Cresson. And I think her husband was named Seymour Rachtzeit. And a guy named Joseph Rumshinsky was the composer. And there were other composers. So I would have enjoyed it, except I was a kid and all the rest of the audience was old people. But I love, when I was 18, my class went to see I Am a Camera with Julie Harris. And that was my first English play. And I kept looking around the theater and I kept saying, I'm in an American play. I'm at an American play. And I couldn't get over it, that I was finally not in the Jewish theater. Of course, now I love to go to the Jewish theater, but those were my feelings.
Were there any other trips you took either with your parents or school trips that you remember fondly?
I don't remember any school trips. With my parents, yes, my father and I, we used to drive around the Catskills. And he used to show me Murder Incorporated used to bury their victims in the lakes in the Catskills. And the lakes were known for that. So my father used to point out lakes like that where Murder Incorporated used to throw the bodies of their victims. And we used to ride around the Catskills to different towns, and I enjoyed that. Oh, an interesting thing. In 2011 and 2013, I went back to Antwerp because the ship that we came to the United States on was a Red Star Line ship. And they were building a Red Star Line museum in Antwerp, dedicated to immigration and the Red Star Line. And when I read that in the Jewish paper, I wrote to them, and they wrote back and came and interviewed me, and then invited me to come to Antwerp, first in 2011 to see the building of this museum, and then in 2013, they had a week's festivities to open this museum. And at that week's festivities, I hung out with one of the daughters of Irving Berlin. Her name is Linda Emmett. She was there with a daughter of hers and a niece of hers, and she donated one of Irving Berlin's pianos to that museum. And I have a tape on my website where first she's talking and then I'm talking. But she told me, and later on, I read it in the book, I'll tell you about it. She told me that Irving Berlin had a summer home in the Catskills in a place called Lou Beach that I never heard of. Lou Beach was the name of a man. It wasn't a beach. It was the town was named for this man, Lou Beach. And that the Irving Berlin family had a summer home in the Catskills. I never knew that. After that, I have newspaper articles about it. I hung out with her the week I was in Belgium. After that, I never heard from her, but I am in touch with his oldest daughter, Mary Ellen Barrett. She's 2 years older than I am, and once in a while I send her an email and she always responds. She's a writer. She wrote a biography or a memoir about her father, which I read, which was excellent. He came on the same shipping line that I did. That's why she was at that opening.
Amazing.
And he was 5 and I was 5. He came from Russia.
I'm trying to think. I want to ask you about college and law school, but I also there's so much about Monticello. Is there anything else about your memories of Monticello that you want to share, or the Catskills in that experience?
Well, the Catskills were a very unique part of Jewish history because during the heyday of the Catskills, and we were there towards the end, but we didn't know that, that used to be the place for Jews from New York City to go for the summer for a vacation. And all the Jewish comedians got their start there. So I was in a very historic place, although I didn't know it at the time. But the Catskills have a fond place in my heart because of that. And I don't think I belong now, but for a good many years, I belonged to an organization called the Catskills Institute, which I think is still around. It was started and it's still run by a guy named Phil Brown, who is a professor now, I think, at Northeastern in Boston. He's a sociology professor. And he started this organization for people who lived or worked in the Catskills during its heyday. And in fact, I'm signed up to listen. One of the organizations I belong to in Sarasota is the Brandeis Committee. And I think some Brandeis committee, not the one in Sarasota, is having a speaker on the Catskills. And I've signed up to hear that. And there are always people talking about the Catskills and writing books about it and all that. I felt bad when I was growing up. I would have liked to have been a guest at Grossinger's, but we never went to any of the resorts because we had a resort ourselves. So many years later, I took a weekend or something and I went to Grossinger's just to have the experience of being a guest there. But basically I was a landlord's daughter.
What was Grossinger's like when you went?
It was like stepping into the past. Yeah, it was really disappointing when I went because the heyday of the big stars like Eddie Fisher and all those kind of people, that was already gone. And they ate like crazy there. The big thing was eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that's about all I remember. But I remember being disappointed because its time was past.
And what do you remember about the families and the people that would come to stay in the Catskills when you were living there?
Well, one thing that I remember was I said that my mother was meticulous. And the people used to come for just a couple of months. They'd rent an apartment. And my mother used to, as I mentioned, she used to go and clean the apartments afterwards with the cleaning women. And she couldn't get over how much dirt those people made in just a few months and didn't clean up. She used to be amazed. She used to say the stoves were just filthy and the refrigerators, and she didn't know how they could get them so filthy and not clean them up when they were only there for a few months. And then it used to be hard on my father because we'd sit down and he had to be a jack of all trades there. Whenever anything went wrong in any of the 25 bungalows, he would be called to fix it. And he used to complain because he'd be eating dinner and he'd be called because somebody's sewage had backed up. And he had to interrupt his dinner and go fix the sewage. But we made a living from that. And the one nice thing was that in the Catskills, most people who had some kind of a resort or who had a home would move to the basement during the summer and rent out their apartment. And my father never did. I don't know where he got these highfalutin ideas. He never did that. He said, I don't rent my home. So in years before I moved to Sarasota, Florida, I was living in Potomac, Maryland in a townhouse. and I would come to Sarasota for a number of months. But I never rented my home in Potomac, Maryland, which other people who go away for the summer do. And then I've met people, I forget what the word is now, the popular thing is that you rent your home to this company. I can't, let me hang up on that. I have never, ever rented out the place where I live. I don't want other people sleeping on my bed or sitting on my couch. And I have that from my father because he did not believe in renting out your home. These people used to go and live in a basement or something for the summer, and because they needed the money from renting their home, but we never did that.
What other traits would you say or characteristics that you have from either of your parents?
Well, I think I keep house like my mother did. Not that I do that much, but I when my daughter was being bat mitzvahed, I was with a group that we planned the bat mitzvah ourselves. We spent about a year doing it. And one of the things we did was we made a list of those things where we were like our parents and those things where we weren't. And it was interesting to me to make that list because a number of things I do like my parents and other things I do not like my parents. So I think we are combinations of what our parents did that we choose to follow, and what they did that I don't choose to follow.
Were there any people in your world or at school, any adults that you looked up to other than your parents?
Yes. The people that I think had the biggest influence in my life were Joe and Ethel Cooperman. They were a husband and wife legal team, and they lived in a town near Monticello called Ellenville, New York. And they were my parents' attorneys. My father invested in second mortgages. And they were the lawyers, Joe and Ethel, who did the legal work that was involved in giving money for second mortgages. And by that, I mean that if somebody needed some money, my father would lend him the money and have a second mortgage on that person's property. So if he didn't pay the mortgage, you could foreclose on it. So I got to know those people. They had an office in a building, a well-known building in Ellenville called the Wayside Inn Building. And while I was going to, I guess before I went to law school, I worked one summer for them as a secretary. And they told me, and I guess I was talking about law school already, or they said that if I wanted to, I could come and work in their office. Under New York state law, I could have become a lawyer, not going to law school, just working in their office and then taking the bar. You could still do that at that time. And I said no, because I wanted the experience of going to law school. So I looked up to those people. They liked me, I liked them. And unbeknownst to me, I was seeing a woman as a lawyer, as a role model. Probably the only woman lawyer I knew, but it was her.
And how old were you, did you say, when you worked for them?
I worked for them before I went to law school, and I went to law school in 1954. So I had 4 years between college and law school, and I must have worked for them during that time, one summer.
And so when you started at when you started in college, was that when the first time you left Monticello?
Yes.
And did your family, your parents, did they stay in Monticello?
Well, let me tell you what happened. So my father and I'm trying to think if my mother was in the car too. I don't remember that. My father drove me to Cornell. And he was an unprepossessing looking kind of guy. And he drove me to Cornell. I guess he brought my suitcases up. And the house mother, we had house mothers at that time. Her name was Miss Armour. And she said to me, "You have to tip that man." And I said to her, "I don't have to tip him. That's my father." So then he left, went back to Monticello. And I was there at Cornell and I made friends up there. But I didn't really fit in. And I was very homesick the first 3 months, terribly homesick. And if my parents had been still in Monticello, I probably would have quit and gone back home. But I didn't do it for two reasons. One, they went to Miami Beach for the winter. So I couldn't go back to Monticello because they weren't there. And I also couldn't go back to Monticello because the whole town would know that I went to college and I didn't make it. So I stuck it out, but I saw all these students, you know, they were all well dressed. They knew what they were doing. They knew where they were going. They belonged to clubs and things. I knew nothing. So I had a roommate, Eleanor Stevens, but she was my roommate my second year. So this would have been my second year. I asked her to hitchhike. In those days, you would hitchhike and it was safe. I asked her to hitchhike with me to Monticello, and she did. We hitchhiked back to Monticello, and we were there a day or two, and then we hitchhiked back. After 3 months, but I think that would have been my second year. But after 3 months, I made friends, I started to feel at home, and it started to be all right. But the first 3 months were very hard on me. I had never been away from home. I was totally unsophisticated. My parents couldn't teach me American ways because they didn't know American ways. So I was basically stumbling around on my own. But after 3 months, I got to feel comfortable.
And did you live in dorms or were they apartments?
Always lived in dorms.
Did you join any clubs or organizations or social groups?
I wanted to say that later on I became active in women's rights, but when I was at college, I don't think although I look in my yearbook, it's funny, I looked in my yearbook and it shows me being in different organizations like the Latin Club or something. I can't really remember that, but I was mostly doing my studies, had friends, and I hung out with them. And I don't think I was in a lot of organizations. But when I go to the yearbook, it shows that I was in some. But I made Phi Beta Kappa and graduated, I don't know, cum laude maybe. I was also first in my law school class when I graduated. So I was mostly doing my studies.
What did you study?
I had no idea. Well, here's what happened. I was really lost. I started out, I knew what I thought, because I like languages. I started out majoring in languages. And I saw myself as an interpreter at the United Nations. That was my goal. So I did that for about a year. And then I said to myself, what is the big deal about interpreting somebody else's language? It's really the person who's making the speech that's saying something significant. You're just interpreting the language. That doesn't add up to a lot. So I dropped that and I became a psych major. I was always interested in psychology and what makes people do what they do. So then I took psychology for about a year. I liked it. But somebody once said to me, you know, if you want to be in the field of psychology, you have to do graduate work. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, in order to be somebody in psychology, you have to get a master's and probably a PhD. So I said, oh, I can't do that. I said, nobody in my family ever went to the first grade. I'm certainly not going beyond college. So then I had to get out of psychology. So then I didn't know what to do. I was going to take a meat cutting course in home ec, which was a field I was never had any interest in, but I was just didn't know what to major in anymore. So then somehow I found out that at Cornell, you could do your senior year at the 2-year graduate school of business and public administration. That was a 2-year school, but you could go to the first year and that could be your senior year of college. So that's what I did. I was first in my class there at this, it was the Graduate School of Business and Public Administration. I took that for a year and then I graduated. So after I graduated, I thought the whole world would be coming to my door to try to hire me because the first person in my family to go to college, wow, and to graduate Phi Beta Kappa from Cornell, wow. So nobody offered me a job. So I wrote 200 letters to top corporations in the United States asking for a job. And I did not get a single reply because people were not hiring women who went to college in those days. I didn't know that. So then my parents kept saying, I had already taken typing in high school. My parents kept saying to go to shorthand, study shorthand. And I kept saying to them, what are you talking about? I went to college. I'm not going to be a secretary. But then when nothing happened, I signed up for the Brown Business School in Hempstead, New York. I'm not sure that that's where it was. And I took shorthand for 2.5 months. I would take it in the morning, and then my mother would dictate to me in the afternoon so I could improve. And after 2.5 months there, I broke all the records and I knew shorthand. And I finished my course on a Friday, and on Monday I had a job as a secretary. So then I was a secretary on and off for about 4 years because I quit to go to Miami Beach for the winter with my parents, then come back and work again. And after that, I went to law school.
I think Sonia will take a short break now, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Right.
Okay, we're recording.
Okay, so before the break, Sonia, you were telling us that you worked as a secretary between college and law school. So when or how did you decide that you wanted to go to law school?
Well, I was working for, thinking back, a couple of things come to mind. I worked for a while for a big company called Cohen-Hole Marks. They were in the clothing field. But they kept shifting me around to different jobs instead of a permanent job, and I didn't like the man I worked for. And at one point they offered me another temporary job, and I said, I'm not going to take it, and I'm going to law school. And I didn't know I was going to say that, and I made that announcement. But then I also remember being a secretary for Fawcett Publications, a magazine publishing company. And I worked for them quite a few years. My boss was very, had a good relationship with him, he used to let me go to Florida for 2, 3, 4 months in the winter with my parents, and I'd come back and he held my job for me. And then I got another job at Fawcett. I was going to read the slush mail, which was unsolicited stories that come in. But I felt like I was getting nowhere fast. So my birthday is May 30th. I decided to have a birthday party for myself. But I decided it like 3 days before my birthday, and my birthday was a holiday weekend. So I called up people to invite them to my birthday party, but it was very short notice and nobody could make it. They'd already made plans for the weekend. So I said to myself, I can't even rely on my friends coming to my birthday party. I better go make a life for myself. And I decided to go to law school. But I had no idea that I really wanted to go or that I would go more than a year or something. And I lived in Long Beach and I went to work in New York. So one day I was coming home from work on the train and I saw the sister of a girl who was a friend of mine, and that sister was a lawyer. So I went and sat with her and I said, hey, I'm thinking of going to law school, but I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. And she encouraged me to go. And I think if that had been another person who didn't encourage me, I might not have gone. So I went thinking, well, I'll go for 1 year. I don't know whether I'll continue it. And that's how I went to law school. Oh, and then the other thing that happened was that as we were always going to Miami Beach for the winter, one time I was driving in my car and I happened to go by the campus of the University of Miami. And it's a lovely campus in Coral Gables. And whenever I see a college, I love colleges. And whenever I see a college, I want to go there. So I saw the University of Miami and I said, oh, I wish I could go there. But then I said I already graduated from Cornell. So then I said, but I could go to law school. So I applied for law school and I took the law aptitude tests. And I was in the 80th and the 90th percentile, and they accepted me, and that's how I went to law school. Didn't apply to any other school.
Only to Miami.
Right.
Did you talk to your parents about your decision before going or before applying?
Very opposed to it, and my brother was more opposed to it. I think I mentioned earlier that he came into the house and spent 2 hours telling me why I shouldn't be going to law school. And then later, years later, he had granddaughters who went to law school, and he was so proud of them. So I went to him one day and I said, you carried on so much when I said I was going to law school, and now your granddaughters are going to law school and you're proud of them. How do you explain that? And he said, time marches on. That was his answer. So make of it what you will.
When you started law school, were there other women in your class?
Yes, I have the statistics on the number of women in my class. I think 7.9% of my law school class were women. And at that time, 3% of the graduating law school students were women. And I mentioned this to, I am friendly with a law professor at the Cornell Law School named Cynthia Bowman. I never took a class with her, but we are friends. And she once said to me that less prestigious law schools like University of Miami were more apt to take women than schools like Harvard at that time. So we had a good number of women in my class.
And what was your experience like in law school?
Everybody told me that when you go to law school, it's not like college. It's not like other schools. You may have done well in school, but law school is a whole different thing. And that all turned out to be a bunch of hooey. I was always a good student. I was a good student at law school. It was no different from anything else. And as I mentioned, I graduated first in my class. But it was hard work. The first year, I really worked very hard. I made outlines and this and that and everything because these people had scared me that it was different. It was no different. You study what you learned, then and you do fine. Um, so then I was living with my parents. I was going to law school. What did you ask me?
No, what the experience was like.
Oh,
So
so a lot of times people ask me if I ran into a lot of discrimination from the male students, and the answer is no. But I had this one thing, and not from the teachers either. But I had this one experience. There was a guy in my class named Larry Perlmutter, and he had a group of friends. Let's say they were 4 or 6 altogether. And the first 6 weeks that I went to law school, excuse me, they were always making comments when I went by, and I can't tell you what they were about. So after 6 weeks of that, I went to that group. It was like a cluster. And I said to them, to Larry, I said, why are you doing that? And he said to me, I didn't know it bothered you. I said, well, yes, it does. And he said, we won't do it anymore. That was the end of it. And that was the only unpleasantness that I had in law school. Teachers, the students, no problem. And one of the teachers, I should say this, who was never a teacher of mine, was responsible for my entire career. When I went to law school, my idea was to go into private practice with my husband, whom I didn't have, like Joe and Ethel Cooperman were. That was my thought. And the summer before I graduated, I worked for a law firm in Miami Beach called Kovner and Mannheimer. And they paid me to clerk there $10 a week. And when my father heard that I was working for $10 a week, he said, oh my God, he says, I paid for all of your education and all of your clothes and the doctor's appointments, and you are working now for $10 a week? But that's what they used to pay law clerks. And there were different things that happened there that left me unimpressed with their practice of law. And it made me think that I didn't want to be in private practice anymore. So I came back after the summer. I had one more year of law school to go. And the idea that I went to law school for was shot. I didn't want to be in private practice anymore. So here I was about to graduate, and I didn't have the slightest idea what I wanted to do. So one day I was in my senior year of law school, and there was a professor there named Nanette Massey. And for a while later on, she was acting dean. But at that time, she was a professor. I never had a course with her. And she called me up and she said, Sonia, did you see a notice on the bulletin board that representatives are coming from the United States Labor Department to recruit here? And I said, Manette, I saw that notice, but I have no interest in ever going to Washington. Because when we used to drive to Miami Beach, we passed through Washington, and it was a big city. I wasn't used to a big city with all these high-rise buildings. And I thought if I took a job in one of those buildings, nobody would ever know that I was alive. And I had absolutely no interest in going to that town. So I said to Manette, I don't want to live in Washington. She said, well, I made an appointment for you Friday at 2. So what could I do? I had to go to the appointment. So I went to the appointment, and afterwards, it was interesting. The person who offered me a job later on became an acquaintance of mine. I can't think of her name. She was a famous woman lawyer, and books have been written about her. A book, not books. A book has been written about her. She became a friend of mine, and she had a big job in the Labor Department. Bessie Margolin was her name. And she offered me a job in the Labor Department, which I took. And then recruiters came from the Department of Justice to recruit. And they had something they called the Attorney General's Program for Honor Law Graduates. And that sounded like a big deal. They offered me a job. So I took their job and I turned down the job with Bessie Margolin. And I went to Washington to work for the federal government.
And this professor, you'd never taken a class with her,
Right.
right? Amazing.
But for the rest of my life, well, we haven't finished my life, but she's no longer alive. But whenever I saw her, I used to say thank you to her for what she did for me. She opened up my whole life. And she always said you would have done well wherever you went. And I'm still close to somebody who knew her. I'm close to a woman named Georgina Anjonis, whose husband was the past president of the Florida Bar Association. She has a significant position at the law school. And she was close to Minette. And we talk about Minette to this day. And there's some kind of a faculty position that is named for Minette. But that's what she did for me. Never took a class with her, no.
What were some of the classes you took while you were in law school that you really liked?
I liked most of my classes. We took torts and constitutional law, tax law, personal injury, which is torts, corporations. That's about what I remember. Antitrust, but that wasn't a special course.
And who were your closest friends in law school?
I was close to the president of the school, or a couple of presidents. I worked with them. I was trying to think whether my senior year, I might have been vice president of the school, but I was certainly secretary of the school. Now that's not a secretarial job. There was a president, a vice president, a secretary. I was the secretary. One of the presidents was Bob Shevin, who later went on the Supreme Court of Florida. Another one was Mort Guilford, whom I was very close to, and I learned a lot from him. And then I was, I guess, in some organizations. I can't remember what they were.
And so how did you first become interested in women's rights? Were you thinking about that at all in law school, in any classes?
Never. Never gave it a thought, and there wasn't such a thing then. What happened was that, remember I told you that from the age of 10, I had this idea that my life had been saved because there was something I was supposed to do. So when I came to Washington, D.C., I had a variety of jobs, but that thought never left me. I was always looking for that spot for which my life was saved. And so I was working for the National Labor Relations Board. I had left the Justice Department, went to work for the National Labor Relations Board, but I was always looking for that for which my life had been saved. And there was a black guy at the NLRB. His name was Art Christopher. He was a trial examiner. And he liked women, and he often invited me to lunch. And he would always hold the carrot in front of me that he had a lot of connections and he could help me get another job. But he never did. Nothing ever panned out. So I had a black friend, Jackie Shepard. And one time I had lunch with Art Christopher, and I saw Jackie, and she said, "How are you?" I said, I just had another lunch with Art Christopher. And again, he's talking about helping me find a job, but he never comes up with anything. So Jackie had gone to the Howard Law School, a black law school in Washington, D.C., very well known. And one of her teachers there, who at one point was also the dean, was a man named Charles T. Duncan. And he had just become the general counsel of a brand new agency called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. So when I said to Jackie, I'm disgusted with this Art Christopher because he keeps taking me to lunch, but he never gets me another job. She said, oh, you want another job? Why don't you go see my former professor at the Howard Law School? He just became general counsel of a new agency, the EOC, and he's looking for people. I said, all right. So I called him up and I made an appointment, and I went into his office and I saw he had these papers all over his desk. And he said to me, and I found out recently that Jackie might have called him and given me a good reference. But I didn't know that at the time. So he said to me, you see these papers on this desk? I said, yeah. He says, they are all applications for the one job I have here. And he said, I don't know why, but I'm going to hire you. And he did. So at that time, the general counsel's office there consisted of 4 people: Charlie Duncan, his deputy, Dick Berg, who hated women's rights, myself, and a young attorney named John DeLucio. So that was a brand new agency. It was formed in response to the movement for Black rights and civil rights. Because of that movement, they formed this agency because a law was passed called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VII prohibited employment discrimination by employers, employment agencies, and labor unions, initially based on race, color, and religion, and national origin. And towards the end of the debate, a Virginia congressman named Howard Smith, who was opposed to the law, proposed an amendment that it should also prohibit sex discrimination. His motives are unclear. He was close to a woman named Alice Paul, who had founded the National Women's Party. I was on the board of trustees for many years. And they didn't want blacks gaining rights at the cost of white women. They didn't want blacks having rights over white women. But on the other hand, he opposed the law altogether. So it's not clear whether he really wanted to amend the law to prohibit sex discrimination, or whether he just wanted to slow or stop the passage of that law because he was a bigot and a segregationist. But after he proposed the amendment, nobody was going to get up and say, we don't want to cover gender discrimination, or at that time, sex discrimination. So the law passed with that in it, which nobody expected and nobody was prepared for. So in the early days of the law, so I came there, I didn't know anything about anything. I didn't have, but I knew that the law prohibited sex discrimination. So whenever I was there and they would be discussing issues of law, I would always say, well, what about sex discrimination? So my boss took to calling me a sex maniac because I raised that issue. And it was going to work for that agency, which in the first year, a year and a quarter, a year and a half, wasn't really enforcing the prohibition against sex discrimination for a number of reasons. So I always spoke up about it. And that's when I became interested in women's rights. And that was the job that I was meant to do.
So when you first started working at the EEOC, do you remember, were there any particular cases that you were working on that you were very invested in or that you still think about?
Very much so, and those were the stewardess cases. At that time, all American Airlines hired women who work today as flight cabin attendants. In those days, they called the women stewardesses and the men were called pursers. They did exactly the same job, but they hired women for the domestic flights and men for overseas flights. And they had all kinds of restrictions on the women doing that job, which they didn't have on the men. Women, when they got married, they were grounded or terminated from their jobs as stewardesses. When they turned 32 or 35, they were grounded or terminated from their jobs. So we had hordes of stewardesses. They had originally filed in New York City with the New York City Commission on Human Rights, but then when Title VII became effective on July 2nd, 1965, they came to us and filed complaints. And I was heavily emotionally involved in those cases because it was ridiculous to me that they had men and women doing the same job and they had all these restrictions on the women and none of them on the men.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in this work for women's rights and fighting sex discrimination?
Well, I guess the biggest challenge was that that was not an issue in this country at that time. There wasn't such a thing. There had been a women's, the first wave of the women's movement. It started in 1848 with a meeting in Seneca Falls, where it was the first time women as a group got together and demanded some rights. But they didn't go very far at that time because the Civil War came around and everybody got caught up in the Civil War and the women's rights meeting, nothing much happened. And there had been no movement for women's rights. There were people here or there who were fighting in those areas, but there was no nationwide movement for women's rights when Howard Smith added that amendment. And by the way, years later, Martha Griffiths, one of my heroes, who had been a member of Congress and later became Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, told me that if Howard Smith hadn't added that amendment, she was prepared to add it. But who knew that? So there was no movement in this country for women's rights at that time. There was no such thing. It's just like I always give the example, supposing you said to me, you want to start an organization and you would like me to join to fight that dogs should wear clothes. I would say, what are you, nuts? No, that's the way women's rights was. It was not an issue in this country. So I think the biggest thing we had in the beginning when I started to give speeches about women's rights and that it was against the law, I would mostly get laughter from the audience. Women's rights? What could that possibly be? So part of what we had to do, and then I became a co-founder of NOW, we had to educate this country that that was an issue here.
Where did you give some of these speeches?
I started giving speeches in 1965, the same year I joined the EOC. Employers, maybe unions too, employers and unions invited me to come and speak to tell them what this new law was about and what this law required. So that's what I did.
And you said I know you mentioned you co-founded NOW.
Oh, I'm one of the co-founders of NOW. There were 49.
How did that come to be?
Well, it came to be as follows. So I was working at the EOC, and this is 1965, maybe early 1966, when a woman came into the office where I worked, to interview my boss, the general counsel, and his deputy, Dick Berg. She had written a book which was, I don't know how to describe it, it changed the world. Her name was Betty Friedan, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963. And basically what that book said was that every woman in the United States wants to get married when she's 17 or 18 and then raise a family. But these women are sitting home in the suburbs and they're not happy. And that book was a bombshell. And everybody said, oh, these women aren't happy. And so she, in 1965, thought that she was going to write a second book about all the progress women had made since she wrote The Feminine Mystique 2 years ago. So she came to my office to interview my boss and his deputy to get information for the second book that she thought she was going to write. But she saw me there, a woman, so she came over to me and she said, what's going on here? What are the problems? What's going on? And I said to myself, if I tell her what's going on, I'm going to lose my job, or I could lose my job. So I said to her, everything's fine here. So she left, and a couple of weeks later, she came back again, and she saw me again. So she again asked me, what's really going on here? So she happened to catch me at a vulnerable time, because I think I had just spoken to the executive director, who was a man named Herman Adelsberg, and he was opposed to women's rights, and so was Dick Berg, the deputy general counsel, and so was Luther Holcomb, the vice chairman. And I had just come up from a meeting with Herman Adelsberg, and I was really down. So I took her in my office, and I had tears rolling down my cheeks. And I said to her, what this country needs is an organization to fight for women, like the NAACP fights for its constituents. And I think that maybe other people she met were saying similar things, because I've heard other people say this at the same. But she wrote an article, which I have in the New York Times, in which she credited me for giving her that idea. But I've heard other people say they said the same thing. So then something else happened. In about June of 1966, there was a meeting in Washington of, there were organizations around the country, still are some, called Commissions on the Status of Women. And they were having their third annual meeting. And Betty was at that meeting, I was not. And those women at that meeting, they were staying at a hotel, I forget where they were all together. They wanted to pass a resolution that the EEOC should start to enforce Title VII for women. And they had heard that Dick Graham, who was one of the 5 commissioners at the EEOC, and he was a feminist, they had heard, he later told me it was incorrect, they had heard that he wasn't going to be reappointed as a commissioner because he was a feminist. So they also wanted to pass a resolution that he should be reappointed. Well, meanwhile, those commissions on the status of women were having that meeting under the, I don't know how you pronounce this word, under the aegis of the Labor Department. And they were told that they didn't have the authority to pass such a resolution, that the EEOC should enforce the law for women. And they were told correctly, because one federal agency can't pass a resolution, or people from a federal agency or different agencies can't pass a resolution telling a federal agency what it should be doing. But the women misinterpreted that. They thought they were being told they couldn't do that because they were women or a women's group. So they got upset. And at lunch, the next day at lunch, they were a group of women, 28 women signed up. And Betty Friedan sat down and wrote that we are starting a new organization called NOW, National Organization for Women, to bring women into the forefront of American life. And 28 women signed up to be the first members. And then there was a second meeting on Halloween weekend that year, 1966, which I did attend, where another 28 men and women joined, and there were 49 founders. That's how NAWPA got founded.
And how long did you stay at the EEOC?
I stayed with the OC the first 8 years. I left in the middle of June 1973.
And how active or involved were you with NOW once it was founded?
I was always a member, but I was not particularly active once it was founded. But I'm a member to this day.
Where did you go after you left the EEOC?
I went to work for a corporation called the GTE Service Corporation, which was the second largest telephone company in the country, second only to AT&T. And they were moving their headquarters from New York City to Stamford, Connecticut. And I went to work for them the same day that they opened their offices in Stamford, Connecticut on June 18, 1973.
And how did you choose to work there?
I decided that I was going to leave the EEOC because there was a new chairman of the EEOC, Bill Brown. And from different things he did, I saw that white people were not going to be promoted there anymore. And the jobs were offered, in my case, the job was offered to a black guy in my office who always slept. He was always asleep in his office. And I should have been offered that job, and I wasn't. He was offered it. So I saw it was time to go. So I looked for another job, and the GTE was advertising in the newspapers, but they were advertising $30,000 a year salary, and I was making that at the time. So I said to my husband, I would be interested in that job, but it's only paying 30 and I'm earning 30 now. So my husband said, ask for 40. So I applied for that job and I asked for 40 and I got 40. So that's how I got that job.
How did you meet your husband?
I was living in Washington, D.C., was living in an apartment in Washington, D.C. And I got to know this woman named Anita Lemos. And she made a lot of parties. She was trying to raise funds for a hospital or a hospital chain called the City of Hope in Los Angeles. And she was always having parties and inviting me to the parties. So she was making a party in Virginia. And she invited me, and she said she was setting me up with some guy who was a banker and that I would meet him at that party. And then I had a friend named Patsy Raines, I think was the last name. She worked with me at the EOC. And Anita fixed her up with a guy named Roberto Fuentes. So Patsy had a blind date, Roberto Fuentes, and I was supposed to meet this guy who was a banker. So I went to the party. Oh, and Roberto was driving, gave us all a ride there. He was driving the car. So I didn't think anything of it. He was a good looking Latin guy, but absolutely not my type. So then I met this banker. I must have spoken to him for 10 seconds and kept going. So then we were told that we have to leave that place. It's closing, but we were invited to somebody's home for another party. And Roberto drove us there, and that's how we met. And afterwards, he called and asked me out, and so on.
And was he Jewish?
No, he was Protestant, but he didn't really practice anything.
What were the attitudes at that time about mixed marriage, either from your family or Jewish friends?
You would think that that my parents and brother, well, my brother became an Orthodox Jew. So you would think that they would be upset that I was marrying out of the religion because they'd always expressed that kind of thing to me. But they were so, by that time I was 42 years old, and they were so happy that I was getting married that they never expressed any opposition to my marrying a non-Jew. My father was gone. My father had died. My brother was alive. My mother was alive. They were so thrilled that I was getting married that nobody questioned the fact that he wasn't Jewish. And he was a very attractive guy. And my brother liked him. My mother liked him. My sister-in-law liked him. So everybody liked him.
Did you have a Jewish wedding?
I did. We were married by a rabbi.
And any children?
I have a daughter. Gave birth to her when I was 43 and a half.
And did you choose to raise your daughter Jewish or more secular?
It was never a question. I discussed that with my husband. It was never a question that she would be raised Jewish. He didn't have any problems with it. He sometimes went to services with me.
And what did he do for work?
He was born in the Dominican Republic, but he considered himself Puerto Rican because he grew up there. And at one point, he had wanted to be a doctor, but he couldn't take the sight of blood. So he was in the medical field. When I met him, he was in charge of a section of the District of Columbia government that put out some kind of newspaper with health statistics. So he was in the health field, but as I said, he was in charge of a section of the District of Columbia government.
And did he support or was he very interested in your work for women's rights?
He didn't have any problems with it. He was pretty good about women's rights. I don't think he had any problem with that. But when we first got married, there was a problem because I was both working and doing all the housework, and I couldn't handle it. So we were married a short time, and I was out with some friends, and I said, I'm doing the cooking, I'm doing the cleaning and everything, and my husband just comes and has dinner. So they said to me, have you spoken to him about it? And I said, no. They said, well, why don't you? So I sat him down and I said, this is not working out. So he agreed to do the grocery shopping and to clear the table and put the dishes in the dishwasher. But it was still unequal on me because, like, if he went out of town on business, which he had to do once in a while, he would just leave and go out of town, you know. But if I had to be away, I would make all kinds of plans. Who's going to take care of our daughter? How's the cooking going to be with this? That was all on me. He would just walk out. So it still wasn't equal, but it was better than it was at the beginning. And he had 3 children from a former marriage. And when they came to our house and saw that after dinner, he cleared the table and put the dishes away in the machine. He had been married many years to their mother. They said they'd never seen him do anything like that in his prior marriage.
Was your mom living nearby, or did she help at all when you had your daughter?
I had to have hire housekeepers. which was the bane of my existence. No, my mother, where was my mother living at that time? I'm trying to think. Oh, she was living in North Miami Beach in the house that they bought when I went to law school. And I was living in Washington, D.C. or Potomac, Maryland, or not Potomac, Maryland, Arlington, Virginia. So she couldn't help me. And I had to find help, live in help. It turned out I needed live in help, but that was it's a tremendous problem. This country has not dealt with it. Married women who work and have children are up against an unbelievable problem in finding affordable, competent household work. We don't have that. My husband used to say that Americans don't like living in somebody else's home. They want their own home. So when I had household help, somebody living in my home with us, they would stay a year or a few months or something and leave. I never had anybody stay longer than a year. So that was the biggest problem I had to face until my daughter turned 14 and didn't need anybody with her anymore. That was such a liberation for me, because until then, it was the biggest problem I had to deal with.
What is your daughter's name?
Zia, she's named for my father, whose name was Zisha. Her name is Zia, and her middle name is for my husband's mother, Monina. So her name is Zia Monina Fuentes. Now she's married. Her last name is Jones, which is a real letdown after all those names.
And what does she do?
She and I have been estranged for many, many years, but she has her own consulting business in the computer field. I don't think she has any employees. I think she's it, but she's had her own firm for just about ever since she graduated. She got a master's in business, and she's pretty well ever since then had this business.
So while you were raising your daughter, did you have the same position, or did you change jobs a bit more?
I changed jobs. I went to work. I left GTE after a number of years. I went to work for TRW Inc., a major corporation based in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was with them for a number of years, maybe 4 or 5 years. And then I returned to Washington, D.C. to work for another federal agency, HUD, the United States Agency for Housing and Urban Development. And that's the agency from which I retired.
What were some of the most important moments for you in the work that you've done for women's rights?
Well, I think the most important thing I did at the EOC was that I wrote the decision for the EOC, finding that United States Airlines could not terminate or ground women on marriage or on turning 32 or 35. I was in Washington, D.C., there was a coterie of women and men who cared about women's rights. And we worked in different agencies, and we shared information, and we all knew each other. So I was known as the one from the EOC. So I just was involved in any issues coming up that had to do with women's rights, particularly in employment.
And who were some of the most important people for you that you worked with?
Well, I think the most important person, but I didn't really work with her, was Martha Griffiths, because she was a voice for women's rights in Congress. My other friends in the women's rights field in Washington was a woman named Mary Eastwood, a woman named Catherine East, a woman named Marguerite Raywalt, and a man named Phineas Hendricks. and another woman named Carruthers Berger, and another woman named Morak Simchak. Those are all people with whom I shared information all the time. And then also Judith Lichtman and Marcia Greenberger. These were people that I would deal with regard to women's rights.
And when or how did you decide to retire when you did?
Well, I was working for HUD. I didn't have any special feelings for that agency. So I decided to retire at the age of 65. And then I had a very unhappy, like a year and a half, when I didn't know what to do with myself. And I thought my life had come to an end and my daughter was off at college. And then I decided to write my memoir. And that took me 5.5 years. And then I started to come to Sarasota. And meanwhile, I got back into women's rights. I am to this day, I write about women's rights. I write articles all the time. And I give speeches all the time. And I'm interviewed all the time. And I have a worldwide feminist email list. Every day I try to read the New York Times and the Washington Post and my Facebook page. And I have this list of people and I send them articles from the newspapers or magazines, mostly from the Times and the Washington Post, that have to do with women's rights. And then I also send them my own experiences when they're relevant and my own thoughts. And I do that every day.
You mentioned your memoir. Did you know for a while that you would want to write a memoir, or how did you decide to start that project?
I planned to write a book on the early cases of the EOC, the early law cases. And there was a guy in my office, a lawyer in my office named Cruz Reynoso, lawyer. And I asked him if he would like to write such a book with me. And he said, yes. So about a year went by and I wrote a lot of chapters of this book. And he didn't write the first thing. So I went to him and I don't know whether he didn't have the time or he didn't have the interest, but he wasn't going to write that book with me. So I had written quite a bit and I gave it to the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, which is affiliated with Harvard and Radcliffe. They have a collection of my papers. So does the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. They have a smaller collection of my papers. So help me out here. What was I telling you about? Oh, what book? So I didn't write that book. I gave them all the chapters and they have them, but that book was never written. So then I thought I didn't want to write that book myself about all the early cases. So I was looking for somebody to write a book with me. When it turned out Cruz Reynoso, who later became a justice of the California Supreme Court. But when I saw he wasn't going to write the book, so then I spent considerable time looking for somebody to write it with me. Well, it turns out if you're a famous person, you can get somebody to write a book with you, but not otherwise. But then I found a couple who said that they're professors at some law school in Virginia, and they said they would give up their being professors for a year or something to write the book with me, but that I would have to give them $50,000 because they would give up their jobs for a year. So I wasn't about to do that. So then I had a friend who worked with foundations, and she said to me that there's a foundation center in downtown Washington, and that I should go there and I might find information on how I could get a grant that would pay me while I was writing my memoir. So I decided to go to that foundation center. And before I went to the bathroom where I have a mirror. I looked in the mirror and I had a conversation with God, which I've never had before or since I'm an atheist. But I said, God, if you want this book to be written, you're going to have to do something because I've tried everything and it's not happening. So then I went to that foundation center to look for about getting a grant. And I found a lot of stuff on getting a grant, but it was a whole field unto itself, and I knew nothing about it, and I wasn't going to do that. But mixed in with all these papers on getting a grant, there was a card from somebody named Sarah Fisher, and she was an editor. So I took that card and I went home and I called her and I said, I'm having this problem trying to write a book. So she said, let's have lunch. So we met downtown Washington at a coffee shop for lunch, for coffee, not lunch. We met for coffee and we were talking and I was telling her that I was trying to get this book written and it wasn't happening with me. And she said to me, that isn't the book you want to write. And I said, it's not. She said, no. She said, you want to write a book like the things you've been telling me about your life and your parents' lives. That's the book you want to write. And you need to go home and write that book yourself. She said, I'll help with you with it if you need any help, which didn't happen. And I went home and it took me 5.5 years and that's the book I wrote.
So to write the book, how did you get or how did you search for information about your parents and their life in Poland?
Good question. A lot of what is in the book I had already written. I had given speeches, I had written stories. I'm a storyteller. So a lot of that I'd already done. So I had to really pull together what I'd already done and write things, but I also made a lot of phone calls to my brother all the time. I was constantly calling him and asking him about certain things, and he would answer me. So he was a big resource for me in that respect.
And you discussed the book with him while you were writing it?
No, but there was one interesting thing. As I mentioned earlier, my mother had 2 abortionists. And one was Jewish and one wasn't. And she liked the one who wasn't better. So when she became pregnant with me, she went to him. But as I said, he was having an affair with a ballerina. And maybe I didn't say it. And he had taken her to the Swiss Alps, so he wasn't available. So I had taken a writing course. There's a writer's workshop in Bethesda, Maryland. And the writing course said that if you write about somebody, it's better to give them a name because your reader can identify better with somebody that has a name. So I gave the Jewish abortionist that my mother didn't get to go to when she was pregnant with me, I gave him the name of Dr. Levy. And I didn't give the other one a name, but I gave him the name Dr. Levy. And then I sent that story to my brother. And I said, read that and tell me if that's about the way it happened. Because he was 14 at the time and I hadn't been born yet. So he called me up and he said, how did you know Dr. Levy's name? I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, that was his name, Dr. Levy. How did you know? So I just gave that doctor the name Levy, and that was his name. But then something happened. I wanted to take out a book about birth control in Germany, to find out what was going on at that time. And I found a book in the Library of Congress by a Dr. Levy Lenz, Levy-Lenz. And that was my mother's abortionist. Although he didn't say in the book at all that he was an abortionist. In the book, he talks about inventing some kind of contraceptive sponge. But that was my mother's abortionist. And I just stumbled on his name.
So was it fairly common, or at least it wasn't unusual at that time in Berlin for a woman to have an abortion?
I asked my mother about that. Well, I asked her about this about birth control, and she said there were not good methods of birth control available. Uh, when she had me was 1928, and she said that there weren't good methods of birth control available. To answer your question, what she told me, which didn't make sense, was that why did she have all these abortions? And she said it wasn't fashionable for well-to-do people or prominent people in Germany to have a lot of children, which didn't make sense because all they had was my brother. So why? But that's what she told me. It wasn't the thing for well-to-do people or prominent people to have a lot of children in Berlin or in Germany. So that's why she had all these abortions. She had 7. And the year before she was born, before I was born, she had an ectopic pregnancy. And she told me that it took a year for her to recover, and that the maid used to walk behind her and give her a teaspoon of tea, a little something she didn't really eat. And the doctor told her she must never get pregnant again. And that's when she became pregnant with me. Oh, and my brother said he didn't want a baby in the house and that he was going to put me in a garbage pail when I was born. So my parents were afraid he would do me harm, and they made arrangements for me to go into some kind of nursing home, not to live at home, because they were afraid my brother would harm me. But when I was born, my brother was always took care of me, and he was always wonderful to me. I didn't have to go to that nursing home.
When you were writing your memoir in those 5 years, was there any part of your book that was difficult to write about?
I think the whole thing was difficult because for those 5.5 years, I didn't go to movies. I didn't do a lot of things. I really concentrated on the book and felt that that was my priority for about 5.5 years. And I pretty well cut out other social activities. So that was the difficulty. That's all I remember. But that was tough because I wanted to go out with friends or go to the movies or whatever. And I stayed home and worked on the book.
Where were you living at that time?
Well, I was living in Potomac, Maryland. I had a townhouse there. I had retired, and then I started spending the winters in Sarasota. So I would have to move all my books and my research and everything to Sarasota and then move it back again. And I'm not a good packer. So every year I used to ship a trunk to Sarasota, plus fill up the car with suitcases and papers and books and all of that. And I did that all those years till the book was finished. And a lot of people say to me, because the book ends in 1978, and a lot of people have said to me over the years, you need to write another book. But I'm not going through that again. It was a lot of work.
Was there anything that didn't make it into the book?
I don't think so. Well, a lot of people have asked me, there isn't much about my husband in the book. First of all, I wrote the book with humor. And so I didn't say a lot about my husband because we got divorced. And so I don't say much about my husband in the book. And a number of people have asked me, why don't I say more about him in the book? Well, I was writing a humorous book, and there's nothing humorous about divorce. So it never occurred to me to say much about him in the book, and I didn't.
When did you and your husband separate?
We separated at the end of 78, and we got a divorce in March of 1980.
And how old was your daughter?
About 7, and it was horrible for her. And I hated doing that to her. She was crazy about her father. She never cared all that much about me, even though I was the one that wanted her and he didn't, because he had 3 children. She never accepted that. She always said I was the one that didn't want her, but I was the one that wanted her. He didn't. She was crazy about her father. And it broke my heart when I had to tell her. It was very hard on her. And it was also hard on her because at that time, she was going to school. She didn't know anybody whose parents were divorced. So we were divorced about 3 months, and I found out, I don't remember how, she hadn't told anybody we were divorced. She was still acting as if we were married. When I found that out, I was stunned, and I went around telling the parents of friends of hers that we were divorced, so she couldn't continue to do that. But it was very hard on her. And yet, some years later, he moved to Puerto Rico. He married a third time. He married a Puerto Rican woman. He was living in Puerto Rico. And he could be harsh and strict with her in a way that I wasn't. So she went down to visit him once with his new wife. And she came back and she said to me, "I'm glad you divorced Daddy. I could never live with him." Which was a surprise. But what happened was when she went down to visit him, I told him that she wasn't doing her homework, and there was a problem at school because she wasn't doing her homework. So when she went down, she did some kind of essay, and he told her it's not adequate. And the whole family went out for a good time that evening, and he told her she had to stay home and work on her paper. I had never done anything like that with her. So she was a little surprised at that. And then she also told me that his wife served him everything before she served her, that his wife treated her like a woman would have treated her husband years ago. And my daughter noticed that. So she said that to me once, but she still was crazy about her father. And it was very hard on her when he died.
When did he pass away?
Well, I can't really tell you, but I think he was in his mid-60s when he died. He got, was odd to me because his daughter from a prior marriage became a doctor. And he went to see her. She was living in California or Arizona or something. And she said to him, she thought he needed to have a physical, that he wasn't feeling, didn't look well. So he found out he had cancer of the liver and another form of cancer. And to my surprise, when I heard that, I did a lot of research on what you can do if you have cancer of the liver, maybe of the colon he had, I don't remember the other one that he had. And he refused to lift a finger to try to help himself. I was so stunned. He said he doesn't want to be a burden on his wife. And he didn't go to doctors. He didn't do anything. He didn't want to be a burden on his wife, and he died. So I always thought he was a very strong man, but I ended up thinking he was weak because he did not fight for his life. I'm not saying he could have been successful, but there were things he could have done, and he didn't do them.
It sounds like, you maintained a friendship after the divorce, or?
No. But he had visitations. He came to see our daughter, but I was not friends with him, no.
Was your did your daughter have a relationship or was she close with his other children?
Yes. And I'm sure she still is now. He had a son, he had two sons and a daughter. And one son lived in the Boston area, and another son lived out in California when my daughter moved to California. And the daughter lived in California, and I think she was close to those children always.
What influenced how you decided to raise your daughter? You mentioned you're an atheist, but it sounds like you raised her Jewish.
Yes. She was raised Jewish. She knows she's Jewish. I don't think she does a lot about it. I don't think her husband is Jewish, but she has considered herself Jewish. But I've been out of touch with her for 15 years, so I have no idea what she's doing. But when I did know her, she always considered herself Jewish, but she didn't go to Jewish organizations or things like that. So I don't think it's much a part of her life.
And how would you describe your Jewish identity today?
Very, very strong. It's interesting to me that for a while, when I got out of Cornell, I went through a period where I was not happy being a Jew. I felt it cut me off from the rest of the world. And there was a period of time where I didn't want to talk to my parents. I was living with them, but I didn't want to talk to them. I didn't like being Jewish. And I think that lasted about a year or two. And interestingly enough, I'm now living in a Jewish senior residence. So I'm a member of a local congregation, a Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, it's called. It's part of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. So I consider myself very Jewish. But I can't tell you anything that I do about it, other than that's what I am. I'm Jewish, I'm a woman, those are things that I am.
And what about looking at current politics or current issues today? Are there any issues that that particularly speak to you?
Well, I'm a very strong Democrat. I hated Donald Trump as much as it's possible to hate any human being. I felt that he did not have a single redeeming quality, either as a human being, as a person, or as a president. Just the most horrible form of humanity you could find. I am thrilled that he was defeated. I don't imagine how I could have gone on if he hadn't been. Of course, I would have, but I can't imagine. I'm very happy with Joe Biden. I hope he lives forever. I'm very happy with Kamala Harris, of course, a woman vice president and such a capable woman. I'm tickled pink that her husband is Jewish and that they have this kind of biracial, bi-religious, whatever it is, marriage. So I'm very happy with that. I'm a very strong Democrat.
Are there any issues today still in women's rights that you think we need to focus on or continue to work on?
Are you kidding me? I have a list of 20 issues in the United States and another 10 in the rest of the world that need to be dealt with. I have lived to see, and I'm very grateful for that. I have lived to see nothing less than a revolution in the legal rights of women in this country. And lately I haven't spoken to young people, but in the past I have. And when I tell them what the world was like in my day, their mouths drop. They don't know, and they can't imagine it. So I am very privileged to have lived, to have been a part of this revolution. But the things that still need to be done are overwhelming, but that's all right. There's no reason that my generation should have done everything and left nothing for the future generations. There are young women and men and older women and men who care about women's rights, and the fight goes on. But do not ask if there's anything left to be done. I myself am involved in one case, and now there are others. Case that I'm involved in involves a charter day school in Leland, North Carolina, which this case started in 2015 because the school said that the female students could not wear shorts or slacks to school, nor could female school teachers. This was a policy of the school. And I was involved in bringing that, in finding lawyers to take that case to court. It was just argued before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And just recently I've learned that there are schools in Florida, in a place called St. Johns County, which I think is near St. Augustine and Jacksonville, that the schools there have a whole panoply of rules that are not based on gender, but they affect girls more. And the people there are fighting that. That's just a minor, well, I don't know if I should call it minor, but there were plenty of issues. One of my favorite ones I mentioned earlier during our talk is that working women still have no place to leave their children and no way to get help in raising their children. And my daughter is maybe 50 now, and it's no better than it was when she was born. Well, this is an area where I know Biden has talked about it, but so far nothing much has been done. This is a huge area where things need to be done for women and men. Men work, women work, and they need to have somebody taking care of the children. So this is a big, big area that I'm very interested in because I lived it. But there are many, many issues still to be fought, and there will be.
Do you have any advice for young feminists or young activists?
I don't go around giving people advice, but something that I always say is that if you want to work in a area like women's rights, you need to work with other people, like-minded people. So I tell people if there's a NOW chapter where they live, they should be a member of that NOW chapter. Or if there are other organizations that appeal to them, but there is not much you can do by yourself, but there's not much you can do if you join with like-minded people.
Okay, Sonia, I think we'll take just one more break, if that's okay.
That's okay.
Okay, I'm recording.
Do you have a message for future generations?
Not really, but I've been very lucky in that I found something that's bigger than my life to be involved in. Of course, it's taken over my life. And as I think I said earlier, if you have a passion, I would tell people to follow it. But on the other hand, it has to be something sensible. If you have a kooky passion, I don't know that I would say that. But if you have a meaningful passion and if you can make a living at it, it's not easy to combine those two. But to me, that's the worthwhile life.
Thank you.
All right, you want to
All
talk
right.
about just
Yes, please.
All right, I'm gonna first show you a picture, but it has a story going with it. The first picture I'm gonna show you is a picture of my brother and me when we were in Antwerp. And it's a picture taken at the city park in Antwerp. So I would have been 5 and he would have been 19. What's interesting was the reason that so then I went back to Antwerp twice. I went in 2011 and 2013 in connection with the Red Star Line Museum there, which is a museum dedicated to immigration and the Red Star Line. And that museum has 6 permanent exhibits, and one of them is about me. So I went to Antwerp, back to Antwerp the first time in 2011 as a guest of the city of Antwerp and the Red Star Line Museum. And then I went in 2013 again as a guest of the city of Antwerp and the Red Star Line Museum. They had a week's opening festivities for the museum. But when I went back in 2011, a magazine editor had the idea that I should, by that time my brother was dead, had the idea that I should go back to that park where I took a picture with my brother when I was 5 years old. And he found that spot in that park. So the first picture I'm going to show you is of me and my brother when I was 5 and he was 19. And the second picture I'll show you was taken in 2011 at the same spot by myself, but the first picture is in it. That editor put the first picture in there so you can see both pictures juxtaposed. All right, so now I'm going to show you the first picture. Can you see it?
Can you
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Erin. You can just direct her.
hold it up a little bit higher? A little higher? A bit more? Perfect.
Okay,
Yes.
and here's the second picture. I hope you can see it. Somebody in this building printed it for me because I don't have a color printer at the moment. How is where I'm holding it?
Can you hold it back a little bit closer to you? That's perfect.
All right,
Yes.
okay. The next picture, let me make some more room here. The next picture is a picture of my parents and myself in Germany. You want me to change how I'm holding it? Tell me.
Maybe just a little bit higher. That's great. Do you know where in Germany the photo was taken?
Berlin. More than that, I can't tell you. This next picture was taken in Poland. It shows my mother sitting next to her father. My mother is at the end next to her father. Next to him is her sister, and there's a little boy, and I don't know who he is.
Can you hold it just a little lower? That's perfect.
This next picture is of me in school in Antwerp. And I'm wearing some kind of something on my head. And I'm trying to think if I'm the third. It's hard to see, but it looks like I'm the third little girl up. Looks like people are sitting in a line and I'm like the third little girl from the bottom. This next picture is on the website of the Red Star Line Museum. It shows me in a toy car. I'm assuming this was taken in Germany.
Can you hold it a little higher? Perfect.
Okay, this next picture is my parents and me and my brother in Germany. This next picture is of my parents and me and a sailor on the SS Western Land 2. That's the ship that took us to the United States from Antwerp.
Can you hold it a little bit higher? Yes.
This next picture is the uncle and aunt that my mother lived with in Warsaw when she had to leave home because her stepmother didn't care for her. She grew up in the home of these people, and they had a son and a daughter. This next picture is the picture taken in Halloween weekend in 1966 at the second meeting when NOW was founded. And at one end of this picture in the front row is sitting Betty Friedan. And there's an African-American woman whom I don't know next to her. And next to her is me. And I'm not wearing glasses, and I'm telling you that so that you can figure out who I am. And the last picture is me shaking hands with President Lyndon Johnson. That was the day, I think I wrote it on the back, April 11th, 1968. That was the day that he signed the Fair Housing Act. And I was working for HUD at the time. And I was invited to come to the White House and see the president sign that act. And it shows me shaking hands with the president. And it also shows Lady Bird Johnston. Interestingly enough, I just finished reading a new biography about her. So you can see the president and his wife in this picture.
Can you hold it a little lower and a little bit closer to you? Perfect.
That's it.
Thank you so much, Sonia.
It was a pleasure.